It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working long hours at my job and barely sleeping. I felt disconnected from myself. A friend of mine told me about a small cabin up in northern Idaho. It was in a very remote place, no nearby towns, and barely any phone signal. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't want distractions, calls, texts, or notifications. Just complete silence for a few days. The cabin was owned by some guy who rented it out through a small local listing website. No fancy app or service. I booked it for 6 days. It was cheap, likely because of how isolated it was. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine forest. It had 1 bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room. No TV, no internet. It looked like the kind of place you'd go to just breathe. I packed up my Jeep with food, bottled water, clothes, a flashlight, batteries, a small camping stove in case the kitchen didn't work properly, and a few books. The drive up took nearly 9 hours. The last hour of it was on a narrow dirt road that twisted deep into the woods. There were no signs, no mile markers, just endless trees. It felt like I was driving straight into the middle of nowhere. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started to set. It looked just like the pictures. Wooden walls darkened with age, a steep roof, and a tiny porch. There was an old metal chair outside and a small pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. I got out, stretched, and looked around. The trees were tall, dense, and quiet. Too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just still air. But I shook that off. I was used to the noise of the city, so this silence was just unfamiliar. I opened the cabin door. It creaked like something out of a horror movie, but inside, everything seemed normal. The furniture was old but clean. There was a wooden dining table with 2 chairs, a couch with a wool blanket tossed over it, and a stone fireplace. The bedroom had a small bed with a thick mattress, an old wardrobe, and a tiny nightstand with a dusty oil lamp. I unloaded my gear, stored the food in the small fridge, and tested the stove. It worked fine. The water ran too, though it smelled a little metallic. I lit a fire in the fireplace just for comfort and made a simple dinner. That night, I slept hard. The silence was so complete that it was almost a physical presence. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard something outside, like a soft crunch of leaves. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing, just trees and darkness. The next day, I woke up feeling better than I had in weeks. I spent most of the morning reading and walking a bit around the cabin. The forest around it was thick and wild, with no trails. I didn't go far. I had no signal on my phone, and getting lost out there wasn't something I wanted to experience. I made coffee on the stove, sat on the porch, and watched the wind move through the trees. It was peaceful. That peace didn't last. On the 3rd night, things started to feel off. I went to bed early. Sometime after midnight, I heard something again. This time it was louder. It sounded like something brushing against the cabin wall, just under the window near the bed. Not fast, not scratching, but a long, slow rub like something soft dragging across the wood. I sat up in bed and listened. I didn't move for 10 minutes. Then it stopped. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and looked outside. I didn't see anything. I circled the cabin, even pointed the light into the trees, but there was nothing out there. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some animal curious about the cabin. I went back to bed, but I didn't fall asleep easily. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The dirt and pine needles near the window were undisturbed. No tracks, nothing knocked over, nothing chewed. I figured maybe I was hearing things. Maybe the wind was stronger than it felt, and it had pushed some tree branches against the wall. That evening, I set up a chair near the porch and sat there until late. I didn't hear anything strange that night, but the 5th day, things changed. I had been feeling a little uneasy, and the quiet was beginning to feel heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I kept thinking I saw something in the corner of my eye when I looked out the windows, just the shape of movement, a flash of black between the trees. But when I stared longer, there was nothing. I blamed my tired mind. I hadn't really spoken to anyone in days, and I was getting restless. Around 3 in the afternoon, I went out for a walk. I stayed close to the cabin, never letting it out of my sight. The woods felt different that day, like they were holding their breath. I saw a deer standing between the trees, completely still, not even blinking. When I stepped toward it, it bolted so fast it vanished in seconds. I came back, made some food, and read for a while. It was already dark by 6:30. The wind picked up, and I heard it whistle through the chimney. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered. Then it went out completely. The fridge turned off, the lights died, and the fireplace went dark. The wind outside got louder. I lit a candle and grabbed my flashlight. I checked the breaker box. All the switches were still on. I went outside to check the generator around the back of the cabin. It was off. The fuel gauge read full. I tried starting it. Nothing, not even a click. I checked the wires and the panel. Everything looked normal. It had worked for days, and now it was completely dead. I went back inside, locked the doors, and sat in the living room. The shadows from the candle made the walls look like they were moving. I had no signal, no power, no clue what was going on. I decided to wait it out. I sat in the chair until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore, then went to bed. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. There was a sound. Slow, steady thuds on the porch. Not heavy like footsteps, but not light like branches either. More like something solid being placed one step at a time. I didn't move. I just lay there and listened. After a while, the sound stopped. I waited until sunrise before going outside. There was nothing there. No marks, no items, no signs of anything. But one thing had changed. The chair on the porch had been moved. It was turned, facing the woods. I hadn't touched it. My heart sank. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Someone had been there. They had moved the chair. Maybe they were watching me. Maybe they had been watching for days. I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night, but the Jeep wouldn't start. The engine turned but never caught. I checked under the hood. The battery was fine. The fuel tank was full. Nothing looked wrong. I tried starting it again and again. Nothing. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my bag, food, water, and flashlight. I was going to walk. I didn't care how long it took. I remembered the dirt road stretched about 30 miles until it met the main highway. I marked my direction and started walking. Every few minutes, I turned back, just in case. I made it maybe 4 miles before I saw something that made my stomach twist. In the dirt, right on the edge of the road, was a small pile of stones stacked in a perfect pyramid. 5 rocks. The top one was small and smooth, almost like someone had placed it there recently. I didn't touch it. I walked around it and kept going. 2 miles later, I saw another one. Same shape, same size. Another 2 miles, another pile. I realized then that someone was ahead of me, or following me, or they had come this way before. The sun began to set. I had no choice but to stop. I found a flat area near the road and made a small fire with my camping stove. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, jumping at every sound. At dawn, I continued walking. Blisters had formed on my feet. My legs ached. I kept going. Then, far ahead, I saw a shape. A vehicle. A white pickup truck parked near a turn in the road. I ran toward it. As I got closer, I saw someone standing beside it. An older man with a gray beard. He looked confused when he saw me. He said he was a ranger patrolling the area. I told him everything. He didn't say much. He gave me a ride to the nearest station, almost 50 miles away. They towed my Jeep later that day. Nothing was wrong with it. The battery worked, the fuel was fine, and the engine started perfectly when tested. The cabin's generator? Same thing. Worked fine when they checked it. I never went back. I still don't know what happened in those woods. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe it was just coincidence. But I never forgot the silence, the feeling of being watched, and the chair turned toward the trees. I haven't gone camping since. I needed to get away for a while. Everything in the city had started to wear me down. The traffic, the constant noise, the pressure from work, the fake smiles and meaningless chatter. It was all too much. I was burning out. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, and I couldn't focus on anything anymore. My head hurt all the time, my body felt heavy, and every morning felt like I had just finished a marathon. I knew I had to get out, just for a while, so I rented a remote cabin I found through a listing online. The place was located deep in northern Minnesota, right next to a lake and surrounded by dense forest. It was advertised as being completely off-grid. No electricity, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just a small wooden cabin with a fireplace, a stocked pantry, and miles of isolation. Sounded perfect. I packed lightly, a few changes of clothes, canned food even though the listing said it was stocked, my hiking boots, flashlight, batteries, a hunting knife I barely knew how to use, a lighter, a journal, and a small camping stove just in case. I drove most of the day, passing through small towns and long stretches of empty roads until the GPS stopped working. From there, I followed printed directions. The last mile was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. Branches scratched the side mirrors, and the tires sunk slightly into the mud. But I finally made it. The cabin was small, maybe 20 by 25 feet, made of rough logs that had darkened over the years. There was a small porch with a single chair, a woodpile to the side, and an old axe stuck into a chopping block. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchen setup with shelves and a water pump. There was also a narrow door in the back that led to what looked like a root cellar. I felt relief settle in my chest the moment I stepped inside. No hum of electricity, no beeping phones, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my boots. I unpacked, stacked my things neatly, and started a fire in the stove. That first night, I fell asleep quickly and slept harder than I had in years. The next few days went by in a blur. I spent my time walking along the lake, writing in my journal, and cooking simple meals over the fire. I even tried fishing, though I didn't catch anything. I didn't care. The peace and silence were enough. Each day felt clearer than the one before. On the 4th night, something changed. I had gone to bed early, worn out from a long hike through the woods. It had started raining just after I returned, a light drizzle that turned into steady drops hitting the roof. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. Not the wind, not the rain. It was soft and uneven, like someone stepping on wet leaves. I lay still, my ears straining. Came from the back of the cabin. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight I kept beside the bed. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the door. Nothing. Just the familiar rough planks of the walls, the stove, my boots by the door. The sound had stopped. I waited, listening hard. After a few minutes of silence, I figured it had been an animal. A raccoon maybe, or a deer passing through. But the next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. Behind the cabin, near the root cellar door, there were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet. The prints were smeared slightly by the rain, but still clearly shaped like feet. I counted at least 7 distinct steps leading from the trees to the door. Then nothing. No return trail. No prints leading away. I checked the cellar door. It was locked from the outside with a rusty latch. Still closed. I stared at it for a while, heart pounding, then walked the perimeter of the cabin. No other tracks. I told myself maybe they were old. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. The rain could have made older prints look fresh. Still, I didn't go for my usual hike that day. I stayed near the cabin, keeping the axe close. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. I kept the fire going and the flashlight within reach. The woods felt different, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the same soft steps. This time, they circled the cabin. I heard them pause near the porch, then move to the back. Then silence. I held my breath for what felt like forever. In the morning, I forced myself to check. More prints. This time, they went around the entire cabin. Still barefoot. Still human. I checked the cellar again. Still locked. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just some crazy drifter passing through. Maybe they were gone. That day, I chopped more firewood than I needed, just to stay busy. I kept the axe near me the whole time. I didn't write in my journal. I didn't even eat much. I just waited for the night. That evening, before the sun fully went down, I nailed some wooden boards across the door and the windows. I found them behind the cabin, half-rotten but good enough to add an extra layer of security. It made me feel a little better. When darkness came, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want any light showing through the cracks. I sat in silence, flashlight off, axe in hand. Hours passed. Then I heard the latch on the cellar move. Just once. A slight rattle. I froze. It rattled again. Then silence. I forced myself to wait until morning. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sun came up, I ran outside. The cellar door was open. The old latch hung broken, snapped clean in half. The darkness inside the cellar seemed to reach out like a hand. I didn't go down. I shut it and stacked firewood against it. Then I packed my things. Fast. I didn't care about the rental agreement or the deposit. I didn't even clean up. I just threw everything in my car and drove. The tires spun in the mud. The branches scraped the sides, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I saw a gas station 3 towns away. I never told anyone what happened. What would I even say? I don't know who it was or why they were there or what they wanted. But I know they were watching, waiting. The cabin listing disappeared a few weeks later. I checked. Maybe the owner pulled it, or maybe someone else rented it. I still think about it sometimes, especially when it's quiet. I wonder if they're still out there, wandering barefoot in the woods, waiting for the next person to come alone. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't usually go out into the woods alone, but sometimes, when life gets a little too loud and the walls of the city start pressing in, I need a break. I found this small cabin through a rental website. It was listed under a generic name, just Creekside Getaway, tucked somewhere deep in the Oregon woods. It looked simple in the photos, weathered wood, small porch surrounded by trees and not much else. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no neighbors, just quiet. The drive took longer than expected. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to little more than packed dirt with potholes. My SUV rocked as I crept along, trees tightening around me, cutting the light. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place looked smaller in person and even more isolated than I imagined. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the soft gurgle of a nearby creek. The cabin itself had a front door that stuck, a small bedroom, a bathroom with cold water only, and a combined kitchen and living room. No electricity except what a little gas generator provided. I unpacked a cooler of food, a few bottles of water, and some camping gear. I left my phone in the glove box of the car. The first night was uneventful. I lit some candles and read a paperback novel by lantern light. It was peaceful, cold, but peaceful. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the couch because the bedroom gave me a weird feeling. Not fear exactly, just a discomfort. Maybe it was the stale air or the musty smell of the mattress. On the second day, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, walking upstream. The woods were thick, pines mostly. The trail wasn't marked, but there was a faint path, maybe from deer or previous hikers. I walked for hours without seeing another soul. That's what I wanted, solitude, but something about the forest made it hard to relax. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I stopped walking, the woods went silent. No birds, no wind, just nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the quiet messing with my head. I turned back around mid-afternoon. About 100 yards from the cabin, I noticed something off. There were footprints, not mine. These were fresh. The soil was soft from recent rain, and I could see the tread clearly. They were boot prints and bigger than mine. Someone had been near the cabin. I stopped and looked around, but the woods were still. Back at the cabin, nothing looked disturbed. The door was still locked. My gear was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I slept with my knife within reach that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin carefully. There were more prints. They circled the cabin, like someone had walked around it several times. I even found one print right under a window. It was smudged, like the person had been standing there for a while. I started a fire in the wood stove and stayed inside that day. I read, ate, drank water. Every now and then, I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. That night, I barred the door with a chair, just in case. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to sounds. Thumps, twigs snapping, the wind howling louder than usual. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing outside the wall near the couch. I held my breath and stayed still for what felt like an hour. In the morning, I found a dead rabbit on the porch. Its neck was broken. Its body laid out neatly like someone had placed it there. I didn't touch it. I left it and went back inside. By now, I was on edge. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was over 2 hours away. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter passing through. Maybe he left the rabbit as some backwoods gift. But in my gut, I didn't believe that. I kept the fire going all day. I checked the woods from every window every hour. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone. But I knew they were out there. I started hearing faint clicks at night. Not from the generator. Something outside, like stones tapping against each other. The next night, I woke up to the sound of the chair I had braced against the door falling over. I grabbed my knife and flashlight. I turned on the lantern and looked around. The door was still shut, locked, but the window beside it was cracked open slightly. I hadn't opened it. I slammed it shut and locked it. The fear in my chest was like ice. My breath was shallow, my hands shaking. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in a corner with my back against the wall. At dawn, I went outside and checked around again. I found another set of prints leading away from the cabin. This time, they were smeared. The ground was scuffed like there had been a struggle. But there was no blood, no sign of anything missing. Still, something had happened. I just didn't know what. That day, I made the decision to leave the next morning. I packed up everything. I fueled the car and kept the keys in my pocket. I didn't care if I lost a few days of my rental money. I wanted out. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark with my knife and flashlight. I listened. Hours passed. Just as I started to doze, I heard something thump against the cabin wall. Then again, and again. Slow, rhythmic, like someone was walking around and slapping the wall with their palm. I waited until I thought the sound had passed, then crept to the window. I didn't see anything, but I noticed something strange in the dirt just beyond the porch. A small wooden carving. It was shaped like a human figure, crude, about the size of my hand, stuck upright in the ground. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go near it. I locked myself inside again. At first light, I rushed outside, grabbed my bag, and got into the car. The carving was still there. A second one was on the hood of the car. I started the engine and drove. Fast as the road would allow. The trees felt like they were closing in on me. Every shadow looked like a person. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even after I got back to town, I couldn't stop shaking. I went straight to a motel and stayed there the night. I didn't sleep. I never went back for the rest of my stuff. I called the rental site and reported the place, said it felt unsafe. They didn't respond. When I tried to look up the listing again, it was gone. I told a few people what happened, but most just said I was stressed or imagining things, that it was just a weird experience in the woods. But I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me. It's been months since then. Sometimes I still hear tapping outside my apartment window, but I live on the 3rd floor. I still think about that weekend sometimes. I try to forget it, but it always comes back when I least expect it. Like when I'm closing my blinds at night and I glance out the window, or when I hear leaves crunching outside my house and I pause for a second longer than I should. I tell myself I'm safe now, that it was just a bad situation, just something that happened and ended. But my mind never really lets it go. It started with a plan to get away. I was living in the city, always surrounded by people, traffic, and noise. I'd been going through a rough few months, work stress, breakup, bills piling up. I needed space. A friend of mine had told me about this cabin up north, deep in the woods near a small town called Elk Bend. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything official. It belonged to his uncle, who only used it for hunting season. My friend gave me the directions, said the place was simple but peaceful, and told me the key was hidden under a flat rock beside the porch. It sounded perfect. No cell service, no internet, just trees, quiet, and time to think. I packed my car on a Thursday evening and hit the road early Friday morning. The drive was long. Once I passed the last gas station, it was 2 more hours of winding forest roads, dirt paths, and occasional stretches where the trees pressed in so tight I had to slow to a crawl. My car wasn't made for off-road, but I took it slow. It was nearly 4 p.m. by the time I found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, hidden from the road by tall pine trees. The roof sagged a little and the siding looked faded, but it was still standing strong. There was a fire pit out front, a stack of wood under a tarp, and a rusty metal chair on the porch. The windows were dusty, and a cobweb hung across the top corner of the doorframe. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds chirping, no wind, just the kind of silence that makes your ears ring a little. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and found the key under the flat rock like my friend said. The inside was musty, smelled like old wood and dust, but it was decent. A small couch, a table with 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom with a twin bed and an old metal frame. There was no electricity, just a few gas lamps and a wood stove. I checked the cabinets, some old cans of food, instant coffee, matches, and a few pans. Everything seemed fine. I spent the first few hours unpacking and walking around the area. The trees were dense and tall, with thick undergrowth between them. I didn't see any trails nearby, so I didn't go far. I wanted to settle in and keep things simple. I built a small fire, made some coffee, and just sat watching the smoke rise as the sun dipped behind the trees. By the time it was dark, I was inside, sitting on the couch with a book and a flashlight. That first night was quiet, a little too quiet. I kept waking up. The forest creaked and groaned, branches shifting outside in the dark. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but I told myself it was just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't feel afraid. Not yet. The next morning, I made oatmeal and stepped outside to stretch. It was cold, and the sky was gray. I walked around the clearing a bit, took in the quiet, and tried to shake the weird feeling I had. Something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, like someone was watching me. Later that day, I chopped some wood and stacked it by the door. I explored maybe 100 feet into the trees, but didn't want to get lost, so I turned back. That night, I fell asleep early. Then things started getting strange. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a thumping noise, a slow, heavy sound, like someone knocking gently on wood. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The sound came again. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I grabbed the flashlight and got out of bed. The cabin had no curtains, so I could see the moonlight outside. I didn't see anything through the windows. I stood still, listening. Nothing. After a few minutes, I walked to the front door and opened it a crack. I aimed the flashlight out across the porch and the clearing. Everything looked the same. The fire pit, the trees. Nothing was out there. I told myself the wood stove sometimes made noise when it cooled down. Maybe that was it. I went back to bed. The next morning, I walked around again. I didn't see any tracks near the porch, but the ground was mostly dry, so that didn't mean much. I brushed it off. By the 3rd night, I was on edge. I had that feeling again, that something was wrong. I stayed inside with the door locked, flashlight and hatchet by my side. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. It was around midnight when I heard it again. The same 3 knocks. This time, they came from the back of the cabin. I froze. The back of the cabin faced the forest, just thick trees and no path. I had never even walked behind it. There were no lights back there, just one small window in the bedroom that looked out into the dark. I stood up and turned off the flashlight. The knocks came again, this time slower, then silence. I walked slowly to the bedroom, keeping low. I stayed away from the window, heart pounding. I didn't look out. I stayed on the floor for a long time. When the sun came up, I finally checked. Nothing, just trees. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing at all. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a tree branch, maybe an animal bumped into the wall. But something about the rhythm of the knocks felt too human. I should have left that day. I really should have, but I didn't. The fourth day was cold and cloudy. I felt uneasy the whole time, like I was being watched. I didn't go outside much. I stayed close to the cabin and kept the fire going. I tried to rest that afternoon, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the back window. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up on the couch with the fire burning low, flashlight in my hand. I kept the lamps off and sat in the dark, watching the windows. Around 3 a.m., I heard something moving outside. Not walking, dragging. It was faint, like something being pulled slowly through the dirt and leaves. It circled the cabin once, then again. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard a soft knock, this time on the window. Not the back one, the one by the couch where I was sitting. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock came again, just once, then silence. I turned my head just slightly and stared at the window, and that's when I saw him, just a shadow, a figure, standing outside the window, not moving, not saying anything, just standing there. I couldn't see his face. He was backlit by the moon, but I could see the shape of a man, tall, shoulders hunched, head tilted slightly. He didn't do anything. He didn't try to get in. He just stood there. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. I didn't even blink. When the first light of morning came, I looked again. He was gone. I went outside once the sun was fully up. My hands were shaking. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, just bare feet, long, wide, and deep. They circled the cabin, stopped at each window, and then walked off into the woods. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I just grabbed my keys, locked the cabin door behind me, and drove. I didn't even stop for gas until I was 2 hours away. Later that day, I called my friend and told him everything. He was shocked, said nobody should have been up there. The place was remote. There wasn't even another cabin for miles. He asked if I saw the guy's face. I didn't, and I don't think I want to. When I got home, I checked the news. Nothing. No missing people. No escaped convicts. Just silence. I thought maybe it was a hunter or some drifter or even someone who used to live there, but nothing ever turned up. I still think about those footprints, bare feet in the middle of nowhere in the cold, and how they circled the cabin. How he knew where each window was. How he never said a word, just watched. It's been over a year now. I don't go camping anymore. I don't stay in cabins. I don't even open my windows at night. And if I ever hear a knock on the glass again, I won't look. I'll just leave. No questions. No hesitation. Because some people don't knock to get in. They knock to let you know they already have. I've always believed I worked best when I isolated myself. Maybe it came from being an only child or growing up in a quiet suburb where you could hear the wind brushing through the trees at night. I liked silence, I liked routine, and I liked being far away from distractions. That's probably why, when I finally decided to finish my first novel, I booked a cabin up in the hills of western North Carolina for 3 weeks. The cabin was off-grid but had solar power, a wood stove, and just enough cell reception if I stood in one specific spot near the edge of the porch. It seemed perfect for what I needed. No internet, no social media, no traffic. Just me, my thoughts, and the story I'd been trying to finish for almost 2 years. I drove up in early November. The road up to the cabin twisted higher and higher until it narrowed to a single dirt track. On one side was the steep slope of the mountain, and on the other was a drop-off that fell down into thick woods. It was one of those roads that made you nervous even if you were being careful. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was sweating and my fingers ached from how tight I had gripped the wheel. The cabin sat in a clearing just big enough for a small yard, surrounded by a sea of brown trees that had already shed most of their leaves. It looked cozy, though. A single-story place with dark wood siding, a stone chimney, and a small front porch. There was a generator behind the cabin that I didn't need to use unless the solar system failed, which the owner assured me was rare. Still, I noted where the fuel cans were stored. The inside smelled like old pine. There was a simple kitchen, a living area with a wood stove and a small couch, a bathroom, and a single bedroom with a queen bed and a small window looking out over the woods. The first few days were peaceful. I split firewood in the mornings, made coffee on the gas stove, and wrote until my hands cramped. I had brought enough food to last nearly a month. Canned soups, pasta, rice, oats, trail mix, powdered milk. All stuff that didn't need to be kept cold. There was a cooler on the porch packed with ice blocks for anything I needed chilled. But I wasn't picky. I wanted to write and be alone. And that's what I got. But by the fourth day, things started to feel different. It wasn't something obvious at first, just small things. I noticed that the cabin didn't get as quiet at night as I thought it would. I'd grown up in wooded areas and I was used to sounds like crickets, owls, wind in the trees, all of that. But here it was different. There was a rhythm to the nighttime noises, and it always seemed to shift around 2 or 3 in the morning. The wind would stop, the air would turn still, and I'd wake up with the feeling that someone had just been in the room with me. Not something supernatural, just like the way your body reacts when someone walks by too close behind you. That strange sixth sense kicking in. I brushed it off as paranoia. I'd read about this before. When you're isolated, especially in nature, your brain can play tricks on you. It wants to hear patterns in noise, wants to spot shapes and shadows, wants to sense movement. It's just trying to protect you. That's what I told myself. The next night, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and I heard something shift out back. It sounded like something brushing up against the siding. A long, slow scrape. I stopped what I was doing and listened. First, nothing. Then another sound, like a soft thud, followed by silence again. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes before I moved. When I finally turned the bathroom light off and walked back toward the living area, I felt the cold air on my legs. The back door was cracked open. I knew I had locked that door. I had checked it when I came in from bringing wood inside for the night. I always made sure both doors were locked before dark. My heart was racing, and I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly. Maybe I didn't pull it shut hard enough. I walked over and closed it again, this time making sure the deadbolt clicked. I stood there for another minute, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, but there wasn't any wind. Not then. I didn't sleep much that night. By the 6th day, I was feeling uneasy all the time. I kept the fire going during the day just for the noise. The silence had started to feel heavy. I would walk out to the edge of the clearing to stretch my legs, but I never went into the woods. I didn't want to. I don't even know why. Something about the way the tree line looked, dark, dense, still, made it feel like I'd be swallowed up if I walked more than a few steps in. I started hearing noises outside during the day too. Sticks cracking in short, sharp bursts, like someone was walking carefully. Too carefully for it to be an animal. No rustling, no scampering, no sniffing. Just one branch snap at a time. On the 7th night, I stayed up late writing. I had almost lost track of time. I looked up from the page when the cabin went dark. Completely, the solar power had shut off. I figured it might be the batteries. Maybe they hadn't gotten enough charge during the cloudy day. I lit one of the lanterns and stepped outside to check the backup generator. When I turned the corner, I stopped cold. The fuel can was tipped over. The cap was off. The generator's main switch had been turned off. I didn't panic right away. I forced myself to stand still, think clearly. Maybe an animal knocked the can over? But that wouldn't explain the switch. That switch was tucked inside a metal casing. No raccoon or bear was flipping it. Someone had been back here. I turned the switch back on, but nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. The generator was dead. I picked up the can. It was nearly empty. There had been 3 full cans stored behind the cabin. Now only one remained, and it had been moved further away, partially hidden under some leaves. That was when I knew someone had been watching me. Maybe from the beginning. Someone who knew I was alone. Someone who had waited. Maybe they had seen the solar panels and decided to wait until they weren't enough. Maybe they had been behind the cabin that night when the door was open. I stood in the dark, sweating despite the cold, and looked out into the woods. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt it, that same cold pull on the back of my neck. I went back inside and locked every door and window. I pushed a chair under the front doorknob. I kept the hatchet I used for splitting wood next to me while I lay on the couch, lantern flickering. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed my bag. I was supposed to stay another 2 weeks, but I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. I didn't care about the writing anymore. I just wanted to be gone. The issue was the road. It had rained overnight, and the dirt track looked like a muddy mess. My car was front-wheel drive, not meant for off-roading, and I knew if I left now and got stuck, I'd be in a worse situation. So I waited. I told myself I'd go first thing the next morning, give the road a day to dry. That night was the longest of my life. Started around midnight. First came the tapping on the back window. I froze, sat up straight, and turned off the lantern. I crept toward the sound. Came again 3 slow, light taps. I waited, holding my breath. Then nothing. I thought it might have been a tree branch. But when I looked out the window in the morning, I saw the smudges. Fingerprints, human ones, long and greasy. The trail leading into the woods behind the cabin had fresh footprints. At least 2 different sets. They weren't there the day before. I didn't wait any longer. I packed the rest of my stuff, grabbed everything I could, and threw it into the back of the car. I didn't care that the road was slick. I just drove. My tires slipped twice going downhill. I thought I'd lose control and end up in the ravine, but somehow I made it back to the paved road. I didn't stop driving until I hit a town with a gas station and a diner. I sat inside for almost 3 hours, just drinking coffee and trying to stop shaking. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't even call the owner. I just left it all there, my food, my extra clothes, the pages I had written. A week later, I got a call from the sheriff's department. They had found the cabin door kicked in. The place had been ransacked, furniture overturned, kitchen drawers pulled out and scattered. No sign of forced entry on the windows, just the door. The generator was gone. One of the axes was missing too. I filed a report, but there was nothing else they could do. No suspects, no arrests, just a vague warning to be careful about going that deep into the woods alone. That was 2 years ago. I haven't gone anywhere remote since. I can't. I still write, but only from home, with the lights on and the doors locked. Every time I hear a noise outside, I check every window. Every time the power flickers, I get a flash of that dark clearing and the feeling that I was never really alone out there. I still don't know who was out there, or why, but I know this. Someone had been watching me. They had planned it. They had waited. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I would have come back at all. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, eating like crap, and constantly glued to my phone or computer. My head felt heavy all the time, like I was in a fog. I figured I just needed to get out of the city for a while. A friend of mine had told me about this old cabin his uncle used to rent out up in the mountains in Idaho. It was cheap, basic, and way out in the woods, which sounded perfect to me. I didn't care if it didn't have internet or even electricity. I just wanted peace and quiet. I packed up my truck with all the essentials. A cooler full of food, jugs of water, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, a lantern, a propane heater, and a pile of firewood. I also brought along a few books and a notebook. I left my phone in the glove box once I arrived. I told myself no screens for the entire trip. I wanted to completely disconnect. The drive took about 6 hours from where I lived. The last part of it was on a narrow dirt road that twisted up through thick pine forest. The trees got taller and thicker the farther I went. It felt like I was driving into another world. There were no signs, no houses, no people, just endless woods. The cabin was tucked back off the road, barely visible through the trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered gray, the windows dusty, the roof sagging in one corner. But it was standing, and that was enough for me. I parked beside it and unloaded my gear. Inside, it was one open room with a small loft above the main space. There was an old cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a beat-up couch, and a cot with a thin mattress. A few shelves lined one wall with some mismatched plates, utensils, and a rusted coffee pot. It smelled musty but not unbearable. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a hand pump for water outside and an outhouse about 30 yards into the trees. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent the mornings making coffee over the stove, then sat on the front steps with a blanket and read for hours. I'd go for hikes in the afternoon, nothing crazy, just wandering through the woods, sticking close to the cabin so I wouldn't get lost. At night, I'd build a fire outside and just stare into it until I got tired enough to go inside and sleep. On the 3rd day, I hiked a little farther than usual. I followed a narrow deer trail up a ridge and found a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't hear birds or animals, just the wind. That struck me as odd. Normally in the woods you hear all kinds of sounds, but it was completely silent. Even the trees didn't creak. I brushed it off and headed back, but I couldn't find the trail again. I had made mental notes of the direction I came from, and I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. I walked in circles for at least an hour before I finally spotted a broken branch I recognized and followed it back down. I ended up coming out about 100 yards from the cabin. I was sweaty, tired, and irritated. That night, I kept thinking about how quiet it was up there. No birds, no bugs, not even squirrels. It made me uneasy. I hadn't thought about it until then, but I hadn't seen any animals since I arrived. No deer, no chipmunks, not even a rabbit. Just silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was the time of year. Maybe they'd all moved lower down the mountain. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I found boot prints near the pump. I hadn't been out there since the day I arrived. I looked at my own boots, compared the treads. They didn't match. These were wider, flatter, not mine. I walked around the cabin, but saw no other signs of anyone. No trash, no tire tracks, nothing. I told myself maybe they were old prints. Maybe someone had stopped by before I arrived, but they looked fresh. The dirt around them hadn't been rained on or disturbed. That night, I locked the cabin door from the inside and pushed the small table in front of it. I didn't really believe anyone was out there, but I was starting to get nervous. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt watchful. I started waking up in the middle of the night, sweating and alert, like something had yanked me out of sleep. I'd lie there in the dark, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard movement outside, branches snapping, the crunch of leaves. But every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. One night, I was sure I heard someone walking around the cabin. I didn't move. I just stayed under the covers, heart pounding, eyes wide open. The steps were slow, steady, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then again. I heard the front step creak, then silence. I stayed awake until morning. I wanted to leave, but I was angry at myself for being scared. This was supposed to be my escape. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was just not used to being this deep in the woods. But I started carrying my hatchet with me everywhere, even inside. On the 6th day, I found something hanging on a tree behind the cabin. It was a small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine, shaped like a person. I had definitely not put it there. It hadn't been there the day before. I checked the area again, no footprints, no sign of anyone. I threw the bundle in the fire that night and stayed inside. That was the night someone tried to open the door. I was lying on the cot, fully awake, when I heard the doorknob turn. It didn't jiggle, it turned, slow and quiet. The table I had pushed in front of it bumped slightly. I jumped up, grabbed the hatchet, and stood near the door. I didn't make a sound. I waited, heart pounding, muscles tense. After a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't care if I was being paranoid anymore. I wanted out. As I loaded my stuff into the truck, I saw something else. Deep boot prints behind the cabin, leading into the woods. The same wide, flat tread as before. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the underbrush. The drive down that mountain felt like it took forever. I kept checking my mirror. Every bump made me tense up. When I finally hit pavement, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I drove until I hit the next town and stopped at a gas station. I looked like hell. Dirty, tired, eyes sunken. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not at first. Felt too strange, too unreal. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone was out there, watching me, walking around my cabin at night, leaving things in the trees, trying the door. It wasn't a ghost or a monster or anything like that. It was a person, a real person, and that's what makes it so much worse. I never went back to that cabin. I never will. I don't even like camping anymore. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear branches snap at night or when the house creaks. I remember how quiet it was up there. I remember the feeling of being watched, and I remember the sound of those slow, heavy steps circling my cabin in the dark. Some people go into the woods looking for peace. I went in looking for quiet, and I found it, but I also found something else, something that still keeps me up at night, because the scariest thing in the woods isn't a bear or a ghost. It's the person who's not supposed to be there and who doesn't want to leave. I was 33 years old when I decided to take a break from everything. Work, city noise, social media, people, all of it. I felt worn out, not tired in the regular sense, but drained in a way I couldn't explain. I had been working back-to-back weeks without any real time off. It felt like I was just floating through life without being present in any of it. So, I booked a week in a small cabin up in the hills, far away from cell service, traffic, or anything remotely loud. The cabin was in northwestern Montana, not too far from the border, but tucked deep into the hills, surrounded by dense forest. It belonged to a man I found through a quiet online rental site. He described it as minimal but safe, and honestly, that's all I was looking for. No internet, no TV, just peace. It didn't even have running water inside, just a well pump outside and a composting toilet. I didn't care. I just wanted to breathe again. I arrived late in the afternoon after driving for nearly 7 hours. The last hour was nothing but winding dirt roads and climbing narrow paths that didn't even feel like real roads. I had a basic map, no GPS, and a printed set of directions the owner sent me. When I finally pulled up to the small clearing with the cabin in it, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Quiet. Not just around me, but inside me. The cabin was old. Not broken down or unsafe, but clearly built decades ago. It was made of thick wood logs that had weathered over time. The door creaked when I opened it, and the floor groaned slightly under my weight, but it was solid. Inside, there was a small table, one chair, a single bed, and a wood stove. Everything smelled like dust and old wood, but it wasn't bad. It felt like it had been untouched for a while, like the world had moved on and forgotten this little space. I unloaded my supplies, cans of food, water containers, a camping stove, a sleeping bag, some clothes, and a few books. I also had a small battery-powered radio and a solar lantern. I was used to camping, so none of this felt strange. If anything, it felt familiar, a return to something simpler. That first evening, I sat on the porch and watched the trees sway. The wind made a soft whistling sound through the branches. I ate a can of chili, watched the last bit of sun dip behind the hills, and listened to the quiet. There weren't even planes flying above, just wind and forest. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I got up early, made instant coffee on the camp stove, and decided to go for a walk. There were no marked trails, but I figured I'd explore a little and get familiar with the area. I wore a small day pack with water, a snack, and my compass. The trees were tall and tight, and the ground was uneven with moss and roots, but it wasn't too hard to move through. I marked a few trees with a small piece of neon ribbon I brought so I wouldn't get turned around. About an hour into the walk, I found something odd. It was a rectangle of flat ground with the grass and moss scraped away. The dirt was a different color, like it had been recently dug up and put back. The shape was about 6 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide. I stopped and stared at it. It looked like a grave, but there was no marker, just disturbed dirt in the middle of the forest. At first, I told myself it was probably just someone's old fire pit or maybe a small spot someone dug up for camping. But there was no sign of ash, rocks, or anything like that, just the shape. I felt uneasy, so I turned back. I followed the ribbons and made it to the cabin by late morning. The rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. I read, collected some firewood, and boiled water. I kept busy. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That rectangle, that dirt, it just didn't feel right. On the third day, I woke up early again, and something felt off. The air was still too still. No birds, no rustling, just silence. I tried to ignore it. I made breakfast and stepped outside. The weather had changed. The sky looked heavier, like it might rain, but not right away. I checked the area around the cabin. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Nothing major, but the logs were shifted. I figured maybe an animal had come by, but there were no tracks. The ground was soft enough that I would have seen something. I told myself not to overthink it. I had come here to rest. I couldn't let my mind start playing games with me. That afternoon, I walked out to the same spot where I saw the rectangle. It hadn't changed. Still the same color. Still no grass growing on it. This time, I noticed something else. A torn piece of cloth a few feet away from the edge of it, half buried in leaves. I pulled it out. It looked like it had come from a shirt, dark blue with a rip in it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but again, something didn't feel right. I brought the cloth back to the cabin and put it on the porch table. I didn't know why. Maybe to remind myself that it was real. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking I heard soft crunches outside, like footsteps. But when I opened the door and shone the lantern, there was nothing. The forest swallowed the light, and the silence swallowed everything else. On the fourth day, I decided to dig. I brought the small camping shovel I kept in my car. I walked out to the spot and started early, before the sun got too high. The ground was packed tighter than I thought it would be. It didn't feel fresh, just unsettled, like it had been dug months ago and the soil had started to harden again. About 2 feet down, I found something. First, it was just more cloth. Then a shoe, an old, dirty sneaker. Then bones. Not large ones, but unmistakable. A hand. I dropped the shovel and stepped back. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was a body. I didn't know what to do. I stood there for a long time, frozen. The forest around me felt thicker now, heavier. I marked the spot with the shovel and ran back to the cabin. I packed a small bag, grabbed the map, and started hiking back toward where I had parked the car a few days ago. It was a long walk, but I needed to get out of there. About halfway through the hike, I noticed something that made me stop. A small tree snapped at the base, not cut, broken, and beside it, boot prints. Not mine, bigger, wider stride, fresh. I wasn't alone out there. I changed direction, moving faster but staying quieter. I didn't want to panic, but I was already sweating. I hiked another half hour and reached the edge of the dirt road. My car was there, but the back hatch was open. My gear had been thrown out. My water containers were slashed. One of the tires was flat, knifed straight through. That's when I knew this wasn't random. I didn't wait. I got in, started the car, and drove on the flat tire until I made it down the hill. Every bump and turn felt like I was going to lose control. After what felt like forever, I reached the main road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station with cell service. I called the sheriff's department and reported everything. The location of the body, the cloth, the broken tree, the boot prints. They met me there, took down every detail I could give. Later, they called to confirm what I already knew. It was human remains, not animal, likely a young adult male. No ID yet, but they were investigating. They towed my car, patched it up, and said they'd keep me updated. Weeks passed. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how close I had been to sleeping over that grave for days. How someone had been watching me. Someone strong enough to snap trees and smart enough to slash my tire but leave me alive. Maybe they thought I wouldn't dig. Maybe they were just waiting for me to leave so they could come back. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even look at forests the same anymore. Every time I see a photo of pine trees or quiet dirt paths, I think about the shape in the ground, the torn cloth, the way the forest went silent that day. Months later, the sheriff called. They identified the remains. It was a man in his 20s, reported missing last year. No known connection to the cabin owner. They questioned him, but nothing stuck. He had an alibi. They checked surrounding properties, found no leads. The case went cold. I never got closure, just fear. And now I always wonder, if I hadn't dug that day, would I have been next? I had been working long hours in the city for years and felt like I was starting to break down. The noise, the screens, the traffic, and the same old cycle of wake, work, sleep, it had worn me down. I was in my early 30s, not old by any means, but I was already waking up tired every day and carrying this heavy feeling in my chest like I was missing something. I needed a break. Not the kind where you sit at home and still check your phone every 5 minutes. I needed to go somewhere quiet, somewhere far. I wanted to breathe cold, clean air, to hear nothing but wind through trees, maybe birds, maybe the distant sound of water. I started looking into cabins for rent. I didn't want anything fancy. I didn't want hot tubs or Netflix, or a cozy loft with candles and wine glasses. I wanted something basic, rough, something out there in the woods where I'd have to haul in my own supplies and maybe even chop some firewood. I wanted to feel something again. I guess that's what it was. I found this listing online. It wasn't even through a big rental website, more like a local ad, a rough-looking post with 3 photos and a short description. Old logging cabin, remote, off-grid, by Clearwater Valley. No phone signal, no electricity, no running water. Bring your own supplies. For WD required to reach trailhead, then 30-minute hike in, $50/night. Minimum 4 nights. That was it. It was perfect. The photos showed a long, low wooden cabin tucked between pine trees. It had a metal roof, some old tools hanging off the side, a fire pit out front, and what looked like a shed or woodshed nearby. It looked beat up but strong. I could smell the sap in the photos. I messaged the number. The guy replied 2 days later, said the place was still available, gave me directions, warned me about the road, and told me to leave cash in a lockbox under the porch. He didn't ask my name. I packed for a week. Food, gas stove, lanterns, knife, extra boots, gloves, a couple thick books I had never had time to read, first aid kit, 2 5-gallon jugs of water, tarp, rope, gun. I didn't normally travel with a gun, but something about being that deep into the woods made me feel better with it. It was a .357 revolver, heavy but reliable, and I knew how to use it, just in case. It was early October when I left. The air was cool but not cold, leaves just starting to turn. I took the highway out of the city, drove 5 hours north, then onto back roads that turned to dirt, then into logging roads that were barely visible at all. I had to keep stopping to check the directions, which were handwritten and hard to follow. Eventually, I found the old trailhead, no sign, just a metal gate I had to open by hand. I left the car there and loaded my backpack. It was heavy, but I only planned to make one trip. I carried the water jugs, one in each hand, and strapped everything else to my back. The trail was barely a trail, mostly just flat ground between trees, but I could see some old boot prints here and there. It was quiet. That was the first thing I noticed. It was dead quiet. No wind, no animals, not even birds. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt and the way my breath came harder and heavier as I climbed over a hill. I didn't like that. I had expected quiet, sure, but not this kind. About 40 minutes in, I saw it. The roof first, then the porch, and then the rest of the cabin as I got closer. It was like the photos, but older. The walls were gray with age. The windows were covered with shutters, and there was moss along the bottom of the siding. The metal roof had patches of rust, but it looked solid. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside was a single room, a cot against one wall, a metal stove with a short chimney, A wooden table with 2 chairs. A shelf with some old cans, dusty and probably expired. A stack of split wood near the door. A few rat traps in the corners. And that was it. I walked through, checking everything. No power, no plumbing. Just like it said. There was a journal on the table. A spiral-bound notebook with a bunch of entries in it, guest log, I guess. People had written little messages over the years. Most said things like, "Great place, very peaceful." Or, "Got snowed in but loved it anyway." Or, "Heard wolves last night. So cool." I read a few pages, then stopped. I didn't want to see something weird and ruin the mood. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, stacked my food in a corner, made a small fire in the stove. I sat in the chair by the window and listened. Still nothing. No birds, no squirrels. That bothered me more than anything else. The first night was fine. Cold, but the fire helped. I stayed wrapped in layers, cooked some beans, read a chapter of my book, then turned off the lantern and lay down. The cot creaked whenever I moved, but I slept well enough. The second day I went exploring. The trees went on for miles. There were no trails, no paths, nothing. Just wild forest. I didn't go too far. Didn't want to get lost. I marked my path with bits of red tape tied to branches. I found a stream about a half-mile down and washed up there. Water was freezing. When I came back to the cabin, I saw something odd. The axe I had left leaning against the porch was lying on the ground. Not where I had left it. Not even close. It was about 10 feet away, near the fire pit. I stood there for a minute, staring at it. Then I told myself maybe I had knocked it over and didn't notice. Maybe it rolled. I picked it up, put it back. That night, I heard a noise. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when I woke up. Something had thudded against the outside wall. Just once. Then silence. I waited. Nothing else happened. I didn't go outside. The next morning, I checked. I didn't see anything. No prints, no marks, no animals. I walked around the cabin twice. The woods were still quiet. Too quiet. That day, I stayed close. Chopped some more wood. Read. Ate. Tried to relax. Around sunset, I walked to the shed. It was about 50 feet from the cabin, old and leaning. Inside were more tools, rusty saws, broken shovel, coil of rope. I saw some old animal bones in one corner. Probably a raccoon that had gotten trapped. It smelled faintly of rot. When I came back, something was different. The front door was open. I had closed it. I was sure I had. I stood there for a long time, not moving. My hand was on my belt, near the revolver. I walked in. Everything looked the same, except my backpack was unzipped. It had been zipped. Now it was open. Nothing missing, just opened. I zipped it, closed the door. This time I dragged the wooden table in front of the door before I slept. That night I didn't sleep much. I heard something walking. It wasn't an animal. Too heavy. 2 feet. It crunched the leaves slowly. I didn't move. I stayed still in the dark and listened. The steps came closer, then paused. Then closer again. Then nothing. I gripped the revolver all night. The next morning I went outside fast, heart still racing. I looked around. Nothing. Then I checked behind the cabin. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Human. I followed them for about 20 yards. Then they vanished. The ground got hard there, dry pine needles. No more tracks. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was walking around out here barefoot? That day I made a decision. I packed most of my stuff and got ready to leave the next morning. I had already paid for 4 nights, but I wasn't staying the full week. Something was wrong here. That night I didn't light the fire. I wanted it dark. I sat on the floor near the window, gun in hand, watching. Started around 2 a.m. Movement in the trees. Then footsteps again. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. The steps circled the cabin. Then stopped. Then a sound at the window. Tap. Then nothing. I didn't move. I waited until morning. When light came, I opened the door fast. Looked around. No one. I walked to the tree line. Nothing. But when I came back to the porch, there was a carving in the wood. A single word. shaky, jagged. Stay. That was it. I lost it. I grabbed my bag, water, gun, and left. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I marched straight out, didn't stop once. Got back to the car by afternoon. Peeled out of that trailhead like something was chasing me. I drove until I saw people, until I saw stores and power lines and heard traffic again. I didn't report it. What would I say? Someone walked around my cabin at night and carved a word? I don't know what that place was. I don't know who else goes out there, but I think someone lives out there. Someone who doesn't want to be found. And I think I almost did find them. I don't go to the woods alone anymore. Not ever. It was supposed to be a quiet week alone. That was all I wanted. Just a full 7 days away from work, away from the city, away from all the noise. My head had been feeling heavy for weeks. Everything felt loud, rushed, and pointless. So I took a chance and booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cable, not even decent cell reception. That's what made me pick it. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road about a mile off a gravel Forest Service road. It was surrounded by thick pine trees on every side. Not another cabin or person in sight. The photos online showed a simple wood structure with a sloped roof, a small front porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, it was even more basic. Just a small living space with a wood stove, a bed against the wall, a little kitchenette, and a bathroom in the back. The only electricity came from a solar panel that powered a few lights. No fridge, no microwave, just a cooler and a propane stove. It was exactly what I needed. I got there on a Sunday morning. It was cold for May, but not freezing. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, pulled my bags out of the trunk, and walked up the steps. The wind made the pine trees groan. The air smelled sharp and clean. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and breathed out. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally think. The first couple days were perfect. I spent time reading old books I had brought, cooking simple meals, going for walks along some of the dirt trails that ran around the cabin. I slept deeply. I didn't dream. I didn't need an alarm clock. Just the sun coming through the small window in the morning. By the fourth day, I'd settled into a routine. Wake up early, make coffee over the propane burner, read for an hour or two, then go for a hike. Sometimes I'd bring a sandwich and stay out for hours. The woods were beautiful. Sometimes I wouldn't see anything but trees and birds all day. Other times I saw tracks, deer, raccoons, and once what I thought might have been a black bear. That fourth evening, though, something felt different. It started with a noise. I had just gotten back from a long walk. I was tired, so I sat on the steps of the porch with a bottle of water and looked out at the trees. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant snapping sound, like a branch breaking. At first, I didn't think much of it. The forest makes sounds. Wind, animals, trees shifting. But this sounded deliberate. Not just one snap, but two, then silence. Then another, closer, like someone was stepping on sticks. I stood up slowly and stared into the trees. I couldn't see anything. The woods were thick, shadows growing long as the sun started dipping. I felt a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. I went inside and locked the door. Told myself it was nothing. Told myself it was a deer. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I didn't go for a walk. I stayed close to the cabin, pretending to read but really just listening. Every noise made me look up. I kept checking the windows. The weird part was I felt watched, like I couldn't relax. I walked around the cabin a few times to prove to myself no one was out there, but the feeling stayed. Then came the footprints. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch to get some air. The ground around the cabin was mostly dirt and pine needles. But right below the steps, I noticed them boot prints. Big ones, too big to be mine. They were fresh, not from the day I arrived. The pattern was different, and they circled the cabin. I followed them. They went around the side, past the back, then disappeared into the woods. My mouth went dry. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen anyone. Who the hell would come all the way out here? I went inside, locked the door, and dragged one of the chairs in front of it. I checked the windows again. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I told myself I was leaving. I packed most of my things by noon, but the car wouldn't start. I turned the key, and it clicked but didn't turn over. Tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood, checked the battery cables, nothing obvious. I hadn't left the lights on or anything. It just wouldn't start. I didn't have cell service, and there was no one to call anyway. I told myself I'd try again later. Maybe it just needed a break. I went back inside, kept the door locked. Every time I heard a bird land on the roof, I jumped. That afternoon, I saw something out the window, just a flicker of movement between the trees. I stared, heart pounding, but it was too fast. Might have been a squirrel, might have been something else. That night, I heard breathing. I was lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The wind had died down. It was too quiet. Then I heard it, right outside the window. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone standing there, waiting. I didn't move, didn't dare. After maybe a minute, it stopped. I stayed like that until sunrise. The next day was worse. I found a dead bird nailed to the porch. That's not an exaggeration. A small bird, maybe a sparrow, had been nailed through the chest to the wood, wings spread out. Blood dried beneath it. My stomach turned. I looked around, heart pounding, but again, I saw no one. I yanked the bird off the wood with shaking hands and threw it into the trees. I didn't even try to eat breakfast. I sat on the floor inside the cabin with my back to the wall, just holding the hammer I'd found in the supply closet. That afternoon, I tried to walk out. I figured I'd follow the road back until I hit a main road or found someone. I packed a bag, left a note inside the cabin with the date, and left. I walked for almost 3 hours, not seeing a single car, just dirt and trees and silence. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. Another dead bird, just like before, nailed to a tree, fresh. That meant someone had been ahead of me, knew where I was going, was watching. I spun around, scanned the woods. Nothing. I ran back. By the time I made it to the cabin, I was shaking, sweating. I slammed the door shut, locked it again, moved the chair back in front. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made me jump. The next morning, I tried the car again. Still didn't start. I opened the hood again, thinking maybe I'd missed something. That's when I saw it. The battery cables had been cut. Clean, sharp cuts. Deliberate. Someone had done this. That was when the fear became something else. Cold, hard panic. I was being messed with, stalked, and whoever it was knew what they were doing. I didn't know what time it was, but I stayed inside the cabin with the hammer and a knife from the kitchen. I didn't eat. I barely drank anything. I sat and listened. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dark. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. One step, then another. They stopped at the door. I held my breath. Then the handle turned. It didn't open. I had locked it, but it turned slowly, then rattled. Once, twice, then silence. I didn't move. I waited. Eventually, the sun came up. That morning, I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, a knife, and left. This time, I didn't follow the road. I cut straight through the woods, using the sun to guide me east. I figured if I kept going long enough, I'd hit a highway or town. I walked for hours. Around midday, I came to a ranger station. It was closed, but there was a radio in a lockbox outside. I used it to call for help. A ranger came within an hour. When I told him what had happened, he called it in. The sheriff showed up later. We went back to the cabin together. The chair was still in front of the door, but the nails from the bird were gone. The footsteps, the prints, most of them were faint or washed away. They towed my car and said they'd investigate, but they never found anyone. No fingerprints, no evidence, nothing. I never went back. Even now, months later, I still think about it. I wonder who it was, what they wanted. If I had waited just one more night, would they have come in? I still can't sleep through the night. I check my doors 3 times before bed. I haven't been in the woods since, and I never will again. I needed to get away. Too many things had piled up at once. Work stress, family problems, and just the constant buzz of living around people all the time. My boss gave me a week off, and I decided not to spend it at home. I didn't want to be near traffic, neighbors, phones, or the constant beeping of appliances. I wanted quiet. I wanted isolation. I'd found the listing for the cabin on an old hunting forum. It was buried in one of those threads from years ago. A man had posted about a remote hunting cabin deep in the Bitterroot Range in Montana. It wasn't on Airbnb or any fancy website. You had to call a number, speak to a guy named Pete, and send a deposit. He'd mail you the keys and a hand-drawn map. It was all old school and seemed kind of shady, but I didn't care. I wanted off the grid, and that's what this promised. The drive took me 10 hours from where I lived. By the time I reached the gravel road leading up to the area marked cabin access, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. I stopped once at a gas station in a small town about 40 miles out to fuel up and grab a few last-minute items. A bag of jerky, more water, some duct tape. I didn't know why I bought the tape. It just felt like one of those you-never-know items. Pete's map was surprisingly easy to follow. It had landmarks like Split Pine, abandoned yellow truck, and River Bend. They were all exactly where the map said they would be. After about an hour of creeping along the narrow dirt road that curved up into the woods, the cabin appeared. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees on all sides. It looked exactly how you'd imagine an old hunting cabin, simple, square, with a pitched roof and a metal chimney sticking out the side. I parked my truck a few feet away and stepped out into the silence. No traffic, no people, just the wind in the trees and the creak of the old boards as I walked up the porch steps. The key worked fine. Inside, it was dark and smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed pushed up against the wall. The mattress was bare, but I'd brought a sleeping bag. There was also a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a sink with a hand pump. No power, no plumbing, just exactly what I needed. The first night, I didn't do much. I unpacked, set up my sleeping area, and had a cold sandwich and a warm can of beer. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the stars. The sky was pitch black, and you could see every star clearly. It was peaceful. I went to bed early and fell asleep quickly, wrapped in my sleeping bag with the cabin door locked behind me. The next morning, I woke up to total silence. Not even birds. It was odd, but not necessarily alarming. I figured the elevation or the colder temperature might have had something to do with it. I ate some granola, filled my canteen from the spring nearby, and decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I had no cell service, no GPS, just Pete's map and my own sense of direction. I didn't plan to go far, just walk for a bit, stretch my legs, and be back before noon. The woods were thick and uneven. There were no real trails, just patches where animals had passed or where fallen trees had left gaps. I saw tracks, maybe deer or elk, and once thought I saw a black bear far off in the trees, but it moved away quickly. Around noon, I started to head back, using a red mark I'd tied on a branch to keep track of direction. When I returned to the cabin, the front door was open. I stopped in my tracks. I remembered locking it. I always lock doors. I double-checked them, even at home. I walked slowly up the porch and stood at the entrance. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. My sleeping bag was still there. My gear was untouched. Food was in the same spot. I did a quick sweep behind the door, in the tiny bathroom, even under the bed, but found nothing. It made my skin crawl, but I told myself I must have just closed it without locking it properly. Maybe the wind blew it open. I spent the rest of the day doing nothing. I read an old paperback I'd brought, wrote a few things in my notebook, and sat on the porch again when the sun went down. Still no birds, still no sound except the wind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the old cabin made me freeze up. I felt exposed. I wasn't scared of animals. I had a rifle and a knife, but something about that open door kept nagging at me. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard movement outside. just light steps like someone walking on dry leaves. I stayed still and listened. The sound stopped after a few minutes. I didn't get up. I didn't look. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling until I finally drifted off near sunrise. Day 3, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the door locked and stayed inside most of the day. I read, I wrote, I even played solitaire with an old deck I found in the drawer. That night, I cooked a can of beans over the small propane stove I'd brought and ate them by the window. As I sat there, I noticed something strange near the tree line. A dark shape. It looked like a person standing still. I squinted but couldn't make it out. I turned off the lantern inside and tried to let my eyes adjust. When I looked back, the shape was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. There were boot prints in the dirt, leading toward the trees. Not mine. I wear hiking shoes. These were deeper, heavier, like work boots. I followed them into the woods for about 20 yards before they vanished. The ground was harder past that, mostly roots and rocks. I turned back. By that point, I wasn't relaxed. I was tense. Everything felt wrong. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but someone had been there. I started locking the door during the day. I moved the table in front of it at night. I kept the rifle loaded, safety on, next to me at all times. On the 5th night, it got worse. I was woken up by a soft tapping. Not on the door, on the window, just once. Then again, then again. I sat up slowly and reached for the rifle. I didn't move toward the window. I didn't speak. I just sat there, heart pounding, eyes staring at the dark glass. After maybe 10 minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the bed with the rifle across my knees, staring at the door and window until daylight came. I wanted to leave that morning, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. All 4 tires on my truck had been slashed. Not flat, completely shredded. Deep cuts, not from rocks or driving. It looked deliberate. That's when panic set in. Whoever was out here didn't want me to leave. I ran back inside, locked the door, and started packing up essentials. I had enough food for a few more days, but I didn't want to wait around. There was no cell service, no radio. I remembered passing an old ranger station on the way up, maybe 8 miles back down the trail. I could hike there. I packed water, food, the rifle, a flashlight, and a knife. I locked the cabin and left a note inside just in case. My name, date, the direction I was heading. I also took Pete's map, folded in my back pocket. I started walking fast, checking behind me often. Nothing followed me. No sound except the wind and my own footsteps. About 4 miles in, I stopped to drink. That's when I heard it, whistling. It was faint, high-pitched, and coming from the trees behind me. A slow, random tune. I couldn't see anyone. I didn't whistle. I just stood there, staring into the woods, heart racing. I started walking again, faster this time. The whistling continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further. I broke into a jog, then a run. Somewhere near the 5th mile, I twisted my ankle on a root and fell hard. I tore my pants, cut my palm, and dropped the rifle. I got up, limping badly, and moved forward, slower now. The whistling had stopped. I kept moving until I saw the ranger station. It was locked and abandoned, but there was an old radio on the wall. I tried it. Nothing. Dead. I found an old road maintenance shed behind the building. Inside, I found a dusty mountain bike, tires flat but rideable. I pumped them with a hand pump I found hanging by the door, and when they held air, I took off down the trail. I made it back to the main road by nightfall. The first house I saw was 2 miles down, and the woman who answered the door called the sheriff. I told them everything. The cabin, the prints, the window tapping, the slashed tires, the whistling. They sent a unit up there. The sheriff called me 2 days later. They found the cabin just as I left it. The table still in front of the door. The note still on the bed. No prints, no gear, nothing disturbed. But near the back of the cabin, buried shallow in the woods, they found a small pit. Inside were dozens of cigarette butts, food wrappers, and a few tools, wire cutters, duct tape, a small handsaw. They didn't find anyone. I never went back to pick up the truck. I never went back to the woods at all. I moved 2 months later. out of state. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know someone watched me. I know someone followed me, and they were ready to wait. It was the middle of October when I drove up to a remote cabin in the Oregon wilderness. I had rented the place for 10 days to get away from everything. I was burnt out from work, tired of city noise, and I hadn't been sleeping well for months. The cabin was listed as a hunting cabin, not anything fancy, and it was miles away from any town or cell service. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive was long. I left Portland early in the morning and didn't reach the last dirt road turnoff until almost dark. The gravel path twisted through thick pine forest, with tall trees on both sides and not a single other car in sight. The GPS had stopped working a while back, but I had written directions printed out. I followed them carefully, reading the handwritten steps. Left after the mile marker nailed to a stump, go past the rusted truck body, and so on. The road ended in a wide clearing, where the cabin sat like a forgotten shed from another time. It was one floor with weathered wooden walls, a small porch with 2 broken chairs, and a chimney that looked cracked near the top. There were no lights, of course. I had brought lanterns, a big flashlight, and a generator I could use if needed. Inside, the place smelled musty, like old wood and mice. It was one big room with a small side area that held a rust-stained sink and a cold cabinet for food. A wood stove stood near the middle of the cabin. The bed was just a thin mattress on a wooden frame pushed up against one wall. There were signs a few hunters or campers had used it before. A few spent shotgun shells were sitting on the windowsill. Some deer antlers hung on a nail near the door, and there were cigarette butts in a tin can by the fireplace. I unpacked my food, rolled out my sleeping bag on the mattress, and set up a lantern on a hook above the bed. Outside, the wind was picking up and night had fully settled in. I locked the door and tried to settle in. The first night passed quietly. I sat on the porch with my lantern for a while, looking at the dark trees swaying in the wind. I heard nothing but the wind and the occasional creak from the forest. I slept surprisingly well. The silence was deep, the kind that presses against your ears after a while. By the 3rd day, I was feeling better already. I spent my time hiking the narrow trails that led away from the cabin, taking photos, making notes in a little journal I brought, and eating simple meals I cooked on a portable camp stove. There was a creek a short walk away, and I used it to refill water. I boiled it every time. The nearest human presence felt miles away. It was peaceful but also a little uneasy. Not scary, just the kind of quiet that feels too deep sometimes. On the 5th night, things changed. I had spent most of the day exploring an area a little further west, where the forest got denser and more shadowed. I came across what looked like an old animal trap rusted into the ground, the kind that snapped closed. It had been there for decades, I figured. There was also a tree that had deep claw marks running up its bark, higher than a man could reach. That gave me pause, but I didn't think too hard on it. Probably a bear. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me around 2 a.m. I heard crunching in the woods outside. Slow, steady footsteps on dry pine needles. I held still and listened. It wasn't a deer. Too slow, too deliberate. It circled the cabin once, then went silent. I stayed in bed, holding my breath. Eventually, I fell back asleep, but I left the lantern on low for the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter. I found footprints. Human ones, big, booted prints. They had come from the trees, circled the cabin, and gone back the same way. I hadn't seen or heard another person since I arrived. I stood there a long time, just staring at those prints. They looked recent, no animal tracks near them. I didn't hear any engines or voices. I was alone, and now I wasn't sure. The 6th day, I didn't hike. I stayed close to the cabin and kept my knife in my pocket. I kept looking over my shoulder. I started noticing things I hadn't before, like how some trees looked like they had been marked with red paint long ago, like logging markers, but they were old, faded, and random. One was right by the path I took to get water. I hadn't noticed it before. Another thing I noticed was a rope tied around a tree about 100 feet from the cabin. Just a single piece of rope, like someone tied it there and forgot about it. That night, I blocked the door with a heavy chair and kept my flashlight and knife next to the mattress. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Same pace, same circling. I sat up in bed, frozen. Then I heard something drag against the side of the cabin. A scraping noise, not loud, but enough to feel it in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't look out the window. I just waited. When it stopped, I waited an hour before lying back down. I barely slept. In the morning, I found a scratch along the cabin wall. It wasn't a natural one. It was deep, maybe done with a knife or metal. I packed my things. I should have left that day. I didn't. I convinced myself it was a prank. A hunter messing with me. Maybe someone had stumbled onto the cabin and decided to be weird. I had 3 more days left. I wanted to push through it. That was a mistake. On the 8th day, I hiked out early to clear my head. I followed a game trail I hadn't used before. It was rough, overgrown, and full of spiderwebs. After about an hour, I found something that made my stomach drop. A campsite, an old one hidden under the trees. A torn tent, a few rotting cans of food, and a backpack covered in moss. It had been there a long time, maybe years. But the weird part was the fire pit. It looked like it had been used recently. The rocks were still black, and the ashes looked fresh. I didn't touch anything. I walked back fast, trying not to look behind me. That night, I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no bugs, no animals. Just quiet. The kind that makes your ears ring. I stayed awake most of the night. Every creak of the cabin made my muscles tense up. On the 9th day, I found more footprints. These were fresher, leading straight up to the back of the cabin. I had never used that path. The prints came from the forest, stopped at the wall, then turned back. I didn't know what the person was doing. Watching me, maybe, testing how close they could get. I didn't want to find out. That evening, I filled my backpack with food and essentials and kept it near the door. I planned to leave at first light. Around midnight, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Breathing. Heavy, deep breathing right outside the cabin. Not footsteps, just slow breathing. It moved from one wall to the next, slow and steady. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move. Stayed for a long time. Then it stopped. I stayed like that until dawn. As soon as I saw the first hint of light, I grabbed my stuff, shoved the chair away from the door, and got out of there. I didn't bother locking the cabin. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't even stop to drink water. I just walked as fast as I could back to my car, always checking behind me. The forest felt heavier than before. The quiet still hadn't lifted. When I reached the clearing where my car was parked, I almost dropped to my knees from relief. Except something was wrong. The driver's side window was cracked open. I never leave it like that. I looked inside. Everything was as I left it, except the glove compartment was open. I always keep it shut. Inside, my road map was gone. That was it. Just the map. I didn't wait to think about it. I got in, started the car, and drove out fast. The gravel road felt like it took an hour to get through. Every bend, I expected to see someone standing in the road. I didn't. When I hit the paved road again, I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station miles away. I called a friend once I got cell service and told them I was heading back to the city early. I never reported it. What would I say? Some guy walked around my cabin and stole my map? It wasn't a crime. It wasn't clear what had even happened. But I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, and they didn't want to be found. And they knew I was there. I haven't been back to the woods since. It was the second week of October when I decided to take a break and get away from everything. I had been working nonstop for months, and my head was foggy all the time. I needed quiet, real quiet, not the kind where cars and people were always humming in the background. I booked a small off-grid cabin way out in the mountains of northern Idaho. The place didn't even show up properly on most maps. I had to use coordinates sent by the owner to find it. No phone signal, no internet, no neighbors. Just trees, hills, and silence. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took almost a full day. I left before sunrise, packed everything I needed: cans of food, bottled water, a propane stove, a lantern, and my hunting rifle just in case. I got there just as the sun was going down. The cabin looked like something out of an old photo. A weathered wooden box with a metal roof, a small porch, and 2 windows on the front. There was a small clearing around it, but otherwise, dense woods swallowed everything. The place looked worn but not broken. It had clearly stood there for years, maybe decades. Inside was simple. 1 room, a bed in the corner with a heavy old blanket, a small table with a chair, a shelf with some tools and supplies, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was also a water pump out back and an outhouse about 20 yards into the woods. It was colder than I expected, so I set up the propane heater right away and unpacked my gear. I made some soup on the stove, ate slowly, and then sat out on the porch. The night was so quiet it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up until about 10, just staring into the trees, trying to let my mind settle. Then I went inside and tried to sleep. It was hard at first. Every creak of the wood, every snap outside, pulled my eyes open. But eventually I drifted off. The next morning was cold and misty. I made coffee, walked a bit around the clearing, and decided to hike a little deeper into the woods. I brought a small pack with me, my knife, and a compass just in case. I had no plans to go far. I just wanted to stretch my legs. The woods were thick and wet, full of moss and fallen branches. After about an hour of walking, I came across an old trail. It wasn't on the map, but it looked like it had once been used regularly. The leaves were flattened slightly, and I could see what looked like very faint boot prints, though they were old. Maybe hunters used it. I followed the trail for a bit, but something about it made me uneasy. I couldn't explain it. The woods suddenly felt denser, darker, and the silence wasn't calming anymore. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't alone. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read, made some food, and started chopping some wood with the axe I found leaning against the wall of the cabin. As night fell, I lit the lantern and sat inside, writing in a small journal I brought. Around 9 p.m., I heard something outside. It was faint, like a twig snapping, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the porch. I froze and listened. Nothing else came. I got up, turned off the lantern, and went to the window. The moonlight was just enough to see the outline of the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. I waited for a while, but nothing happened. I figured it was a deer or a raccoon. But the next morning, I saw something strange. Near the tree line, about 15 feet from the edge of the clearing, was a footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, bigger than mine too, but not by much. It looked like someone had walked barefoot through the woods and stopped right there. The print pointed toward the cabin. No others around it, just that one. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go out exploring. I kept the rifle nearby and spent most of the day cutting more wood and checking around the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like something had shifted in the forest. The birds weren't chirping like they did the day before. It was just still. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside. Not loud, but enough to keep my nerves stretched tight. I kept the rifle next to me, but every time I got up and looked outside, I saw nothing. The next morning, I found more prints. This time, too. One on the far side of the cabin, behind it. Another close to the outhouse. Again, bare feet. Same size. Still only one direction, toward the cabin. It didn't make sense. There were no prints leading away, just leading to, like someone came in from the woods and vanished. I started to get serious about checking the area. I walked around the cabin in a wide circle, trying to see if maybe someone was hiding out in the woods. Maybe a hiker got lost or a squatter. I didn't find anything. No broken branches, no gear, no shelter, nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something told me not to. Maybe it was stubbornness or curiosity, or maybe I thought it would just stop. That night, I locked the door, shut the windows tight, and kept the lantern off. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap. Around midnight, I heard movement on the porch. Slow, one step at a time. The wood creaked lightly under the weight. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. Then the steps stopped, right outside the door. I didn't move. I just sat there, not breathing. I didn't hear knocking or scratching, just silence. I waited maybe an hour, maybe more. Then finally, the steps moved again, slowly off the porch and back into the woods. I stayed up until sunrise. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty, but there was another footprint, right in front of the door. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my stuff and loaded it into the truck. But before I left, I walked out to the old trail I had found on the first day. I don't know why, I just had to. I followed it deeper this time, maybe half a mile. Then I found something that stopped me cold. It was a small shack hidden between thick trees. Rotten wood, half-collapsed roof, no windows. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I went closer. Inside were a few broken crates, a rusted bed frame, and old clothes. But the strangest thing was the stack of notebooks in the corner. I picked one up. The handwriting was messy, but readable. It was like a journal. The entries were short, written over years. They talked about someone living alone, watching the woods, talking about hearing footsteps at night, finding footprints, feeling watched. One of the last entries said, "He only comes when you're alone, and he never speaks, never leaves a trace, just watches." I didn't read anymore. I dropped the notebook and walked quickly back to my truck. I didn't look back. I drove the full day without stopping. When I got home, I didn't talk to anyone about it. I told people the trip was quiet, peaceful, but I kept thinking about that cabin, that trail, and those footprints. The silence, the feeling of being watched. Weeks passed, then a month, then two. I thought maybe I had imagined some of it. Maybe stress had made things seem worse than they were. But one morning, I went to my front porch to get the newspaper, and there it was, a single barefoot footprint, facing my front door. No others. It was late October when I decided to take a week off from everything and stay alone in a remote cabin deep in the northern woods of Montana. The last few months at work had drained me, and I hadn't had a proper break in years. I found this small, off-the-grid place through a listing online. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. Just a wooden cabin surrounded by miles of thick trees, tall hills, and nothing else. I packed up my truck with all the basics. Canned food, a few gallons of water, a camping stove, warm clothes, a good knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a hatchet, a sleeping bag, and my old rifle. I wasn't planning to hunt, but it was bear country, and I wasn't about to take any chances. It took about 7 hours of driving, most of it through narrow dirt roads and winding forest paths, to finally reach the place. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the pictures. One small room, wooden walls dark from years of weather, a rusted metal chimney sticking out from the roof, and a small front porch that creaked under my boots. There was a small creek behind the cabin and a thin trail that went off into the trees, but I didn't explore much the first day. That first night was quiet, dead quiet. No sounds of traffic, no hum of electronics. Just the occasional crack of branches in the wind, maybe a distant owl. Took me a while to fall asleep because of how quiet it was. You don't realize how used to city noise you are until it's completely gone. The next morning, I made a small fire in the wood stove to heat the place. I had brought dry logs with me, but there were plenty of fallen branches nearby. I spent a few hours chopping wood and stacking it near the door. Then I followed the creek a bit, trying to get a better idea of the area. It was peaceful, cold, but peaceful. I saw some deer tracks, maybe a fox or something smaller, but nothing alarming. On the third day, things started to feel different. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached and my mouth was dry even though I had water the night before. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just adjusting to the cold or the change in sleeping patterns. I spent that afternoon hiking further out, past the creek and up a small hill behind the cabin. The view from up there stretched across a long valley with trees as far as I could see. I sat up there for a while, just listening to the wind move through the branches. But as I turned to head back down, I noticed something odd. There was a shape on the opposite ridge. I squinted. It looked like a person, but it was too far to be sure. They were just standing there, not moving. I watched for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. The shape never moved. I felt stupid staring like that, but something about it just seemed off. Eventually, I turned and made my way back to the cabin, telling myself it was probably just a tree or rock that looked strange from that angle. That night, I heard footsteps. They were light, slow, and definitely human. The sound came from behind the cabin, near the creek. I sat up in my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight and rifle. I didn't go outside. I just listened. The footsteps moved around the back, paused for a while, then faded away into the woods. I barely slept. In the morning, I went out to check. I didn't find any tracks, but the ground was hard and covered in leaves, so that didn't mean much. Still, I told myself it was probably an animal, even though it didn't sound like one. I tried to keep myself busy. I chopped more wood, walked up the trail again, tried to write in a journal. But I kept thinking about the footsteps. I hadn't seen any other people for days. On the 5th day, I found something hanging on the door. It was a rabbit, dead, strung up by its back legs, throat slit clean. It wasn't there the night before. I stared at it for a long time. It was fresh. The blood hadn't even frozen yet. I cut it down and tossed it into the woods. My heart was pounding the whole time. I walked around the cabin, checked the woods nearby. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. I stayed close to the cabin the rest of that day, rifle always nearby. That night, the footsteps came back. They were louder this time, more deliberate, like whoever it was knew I was listening. I sat in the dark, not even turning on the flashlight. I just waited, breathing slowly, ears straining for every sound. The steps came up to the porch and stopped. The wood creaked, then silence. Nothing for minutes. I waited, rifle pointed at the door. Then I heard the doorknob move. Just a small click, like someone tested it. I stood up slowly, heart in my throat. I didn't breathe. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like an hour, I moved a chair against the door and tried to sleep. I didn't really. I just laid there in the dark, waiting for something else to happen. The next morning, I made a decision to leave. I packed what I could into my bag and brought the rifle with me. I didn't even bother to take all the food or supplies. I just wanted to get out. The truck was parked a quarter-mile away, down a narrow dirt path too small for it to come up to the cabin. When I reached the truck, I found the tires slashed. All 4, clean cuts, deep, done with a knife. My legs almost gave out. I backed away, heart racing, eyes darting around the trees. Nothing moved, no sound. I climbed into the truck anyway and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time trying to think. I had no way to call for help, no signal. The nearest town was almost 20 miles away, and the only way there was through thick woods and steep hills. I had a paper map in my glove box. I studied it for a while, then decided to try walking. I left a note in the cabin in case someone came looking. I wrote the direction I was going and the time I left. Then I started walking. I stuck to the dirt road for the first few miles. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Every branch that snapped under my boot made me jump. I kept the rifle ready, eyes scanning the trees. Then I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, soft crunching. I stopped. I waited. Nothing. I walked faster. The sound came back, still behind me, still matching my steps. I spun around once, twice, nothing. Just trees. I walked faster, nearly jogging now. My breath came out in clouds. The weight of the rifle made my arms ache. I heard the steps again, closer this time. I broke into a full sprint. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe a mile, maybe more. I finally ducked off the road and into the trees, crouching behind a thick fallen log, rifle aimed back toward the road. After a few minutes, someone passed by. A man, wearing dark clothes. No bag, no gear, just walking. Slow, deliberate, like he was sure I'd be close. He didn't look around. He just walked down the road. I waited until he was gone. Then I cut through the woods, moving parallel to the road but hidden. I walked for hours. I drank from my water bottle and ate a granola bar. My feet hurt, my shoulders hurt, but I didn't stop until the sun was low. That night I didn't sleep. I curled up beneath some rocks and fallen branches, rifle in my arms, listening. I thought I heard something once or twice, but nothing came. By mid-morning the next day, I reached a ranger station. It was old and looked unused, but the door was open and there was a CB radio inside. I tried it, and by some miracle, someone answered. An hour later, a ranger showed up on an ATV. He looked at me like I was half dead. He drove me back to the station where I explained what happened. Police checked the cabin. They found the rabbit, still rotting where I had thrown it. They found footprints around the cabin, but no signs of the man. My tires were definitely slashed, cleanly, with a blade. No animals could have done that. They never found the guy. No prints, no ID, nothing. Just vanished into the woods. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not alone. And I don't book cabins online unless I know the owner. I learned the hard way that not all places are safe just because they're quiet. Some places are quiet for a reason. I was 33 the year I decided to take some time off from everything. The job I had at the time was wearing me down. I had worked in city construction management for 9 years without a proper break. Early mornings, late evenings, constant noise, arguments over budgets, blueprints, site permits. It wasn't just work that drained me either. My apartment felt more like a cage than a home. You could hear people above, below, and beside you. I was tired. Tired in a deep way that didn't go away with sleep. So I found a cabin. Not a resort. Not a rental with cute little throw pillows and fast Wi-Fi. A real old-school wooden cabin. It was deep into rural Pennsylvania, just outside a small town called Darien Falls. I found it on a back page of a classified site. Someone was offering a month-long sublet, cash only. I didn't care how it looked as long as it was quiet, isolated, and came with 4 solid walls. The drive out took nearly 6 hours. I remember the roads got narrower and bumpier the deeper I went. There were long stretches where the GPS gave up completely. My cell service died about an hour before I arrived. The road it sat on was called Black Hollow Road. Just a cracked 2-lane path that curved around woods thick with trees leaning so close together they almost touched overhead. The cabin itself sat about half a mile off the main road, hidden behind a patch of tall oaks. The driveway was just packed dirt. I parked my SUV in a clearing near the front porch and just sat there for a minute, windows rolled down, listening to nothing. And I mean nothing, no cars, no people, no machines, not even birds right then. That silence. It was the kind that rings in your ears. The cabin looked old, maybe built in the 70s or earlier. It was a single story, made from dark wood, probably pine or cedar, weathered and worn smooth by years of storms and sun. A short set of steps led up to a porch with a sagging roof. The lockbox on the front door worked just fine. Inside, the cabin smelled like old firewood, dust, and something else, a little like dry rot but not overwhelming. It had everything I needed. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a living room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a double bed and 1 window. No TV, no internet, no cell signal. It was perfect. The first few days were calm. I read books I had packed but never touched. I took long naps. I hiked the woods behind the cabin and followed deer paths until I was too tired to keep going. There was no one else around. Not a single car passed the road outside. The nights were cold, even in late spring, and I burned logs in the fireplace while I sat bundled in an old wool blanket with coffee that tasted better than any I'd had in the city. It was the 3rd night that something changed. I went to bed around 10. It had rained most of the evening, and the water on the roof made a slow tapping sound. I slept deep until something woke me up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just this small sound outside, like a foot dragging across gravel or leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a bear. I stayed in bed, listened carefully, but didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I fell back asleep. Next morning, I checked outside just to be sure. There were wet leaves scattered near the porch steps. No tracks. I figured I had imagined it. Sound can play tricks on you when you're that far removed from city noise. On the 5th day, I decided to hike out to a stream I had seen from a ridge the day before. I packed a lunch, a knife, and a map I bought from the gas station in Darien Falls. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the water. I ate on a rock by the stream and took my time heading back. I stopped to sketch a strange-looking pine tree I came across. It had claw marks on it, for long grooves dug deep into the bark. I assumed it was a black bear. There are signs posted all over the county about them. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder. I was lying in bed, not yet asleep, when I heard something scrape against the cabin wall. It came from the backside, behind the bedroom. A slow dragging noise. Then it stopped. Then it happened again, lower down, closer to the ground. I got up and grabbed my flashlight. When I opened the back door, I saw nothing. I walked the edge of the cabin slowly, light sweeping across trees and shrubs, but there was nothing out of place. The following morning, I noticed something odd. The firewood stack had shifted. A few pieces were lying on the ground. The strange part was that they weren't just scattered randomly. They were neatly laid in a row about 2 feet from the pile. It was almost like someone moved them and forgot to finish what they were doing. Still, I tried to be logical. Maybe an animal? Maybe they had just rolled down from the stack and landed that way. Over the next 2 days, I became more alert. Not panicked, just more careful. I kept my knife with me at all times. I double-checked the doors and windows before bed. I even put a few small sticks against the back windowsill so if someone opened it, the sticks would fall and make noise, just in case. Then came the 8th night. Started around 2 a.m. A sharp thump hit the wall near the kitchen. Then a dragging noise. Then silence. 10 minutes later, something tapped on the front door. Not a knock, just a single tap, like someone pressing a finger to the wood. I didn't open it. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of the bed with my flashlight and my knife, heart racing, ears straining. No more sounds came. The first light, I opened the door. There was a dead squirrel lying just outside, half crushed. His head was missing. The body had no blood around it, just the stiff shape curled in on itself like it had been dropped there. I stood staring at it for a while, trying to figure out what that meant. Predator wouldn't leave prey untouched like that. And if it had been dropped from above by a bird, there would have been a mark, something more chaotic. I buried it behind the cabin and tried not to think about it. Later that day, I made the decision to set up a small tripwire. I had some fishing line in my bag. I strung it low, just inches off the ground, across the path leading to the back door. I tied some small tin bottle caps to the line so they'd rattle if disturbed. It was a crude system, but enough to make noise. The next night, I stayed awake on purpose. Around 3:20 a.m., I heard the caps jingle. Something had tripped the line. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window, but it was pitch black outside, and my flashlight beam didn't catch anything. I didn't hear footsteps running away. No rustling, no animals darting off, just nothing. Whatever had come close enough to the cabin had moved silently and left no trace. When I checked the line in the morning, I found that the bottle caps had been cut off. Not ripped or broken, *cut star. Cleanly. The fishing line was still tied to the trees on either end, but the caps were missing. That day, I decided I would leave. I packed most of my things and planned to sleep one last night, then drive out at first light. But that final night, it was worse than the others. I went to bed dressed, shoes on, jacket nearby, knife under the pillow. I didn't bother with the fireplace. I wanted the cabin as quiet as possible. The noise started early. Around midnight, something scraped along the front porch. I could hear the boards creaking, then a thump against the front door, then another. I stayed in bed, frozen, heart thudding hard enough to make my fingers tremble. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too loudly. Then silence. 20 minutes passed. Nothing more. And then I heard the sound I had dreaded most. The back door's latch clicking. I knew it was locked. I had checked it 3 times. But the latch made that soft, metal-on-metal sound like someone was slowly trying to push it open. I stood, stepped into the hallway, and held my breath. The sound stopped, but then footsteps. Inside. Soft, slow, cautious, like someone trying to walk without making noise. But the old wooden floor creaked ever so slightly. Once, twice. I held my knife tighter and backed toward the living room, where the fireplace poker sat in the stand. My flashlight was in my pocket. Then, nothing. No more steps. Just the silence pressing in like a weight. I stayed in the corner of the room for the next 2 hours. Never moved. Just stared into the dark. Eventually, the first light came through the window. I finally turned on the flashlight and did a sweep. The back door was closed, still locked, but muddy prints, bare feet were on the floor near it. They led to the hallway, but they didn't lead back out. I checked every inch of the cabin, every closet, every crawl space, even under the bed. Nothing. Whoever or whatever had walked inside had left no trail, no signs of leaving. But I knew they had been there. I had heard them. I didn't bother cleaning up. I left everything, grabbed my bag, locked the door behind me, and got in the SUV. The drive out felt like it took forever. I didn't even stop for gas until I was almost 2 towns over. I never went back. A week later, I filed a report with the sheriff's office in Darien Falls. They listened. It was supposed to be a quiet week away from the noise of the city. I had taken time off work, packed up my old Ford pickup, and headed deep into the northern woods of Montana. I needed the silence, the space, the clean air. My plan was simple. Spend a week in a remote cabin, no phone, no internet, no one around for miles. Just me, my thoughts, and the forest. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was an old wooden structure I'd rented online. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest town and nearly 5 miles from the closest dirt road. I had to drive up a winding path through thick trees and then hike the last half mile to reach it. When I finally arrived, I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air and listening to the quiet. There was a stillness in the woods that you just don't get anywhere else. The cabin was small but sturdy. One room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a small kitchenette, and a single table with a chair. There was an outhouse about 20 feet behind it. A hand pump for water stood outside, and I had packed enough supplies to last the week. Canned food, bottled water, firewood, and a few essentials like a flashlight, a first aid kit, and some tools. I kept a loaded revolver with me too. Not because I expected trouble, but because you just never know in the wilderness. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent the mornings chopping wood and cleaning up around the cabin. In the afternoons, I went on long hikes into the woods, always marking trees with tape so I could find my way back. At night, I sat by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes just staring into the flames. It was exactly what I needed. But on the third night, things changed. It started with a sound. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. It wasn't the normal sounds of animals or wind through the trees. It was a dull, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I sat up and held my breath, trying to make it out. The sound was slow, steady, and coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and the revolver and stood by the door. I didn't open it at first. I just listened. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before finally stepping outside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. I walked around the cabin, checked the outhouse, and looked down the trail I had come from. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I chalked it up to an animal and went back inside. The next day, I went further into the woods than I had before. I brought a backpack with food, water, and my revolver, and I marked trees along the way with red tape. About 2 hours in, I found something strange. It was a clearing, almost perfectly circular, with no underbrush. The ground had been cleared of leaves and debris, and in the middle was a pile of rocks arranged in a neat triangle. There were no signs of human footprints, no discarded items, nothing that told me who had made it or why. It gave me a bad feeling. I didn't stay long. I turned around and headed straight back to the cabin, checking the tape markers on the trees every few minutes. But the trail didn't feel the same. I knew I was following my own markers, but the forest around me felt different, heavier, quieter. Even the birds seemed to have stopped. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that clearing, that pile of rocks. Around midnight, I heard the dragging sound again. This time, it was closer, much closer. I turned off the lights, stood by the window, and watched. After a minute, I saw something move between the trees. A shape, tall and wide. It moved slowly, almost deliberately. It didn't look like an animal. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline, but it was big. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I found deep tracks around the cabin. Not boot prints. They were too long, too flat, like something heavy had been pressed into the ground. I followed them for about 30 feet before they disappeared into the undergrowth. Whatever it was, it had come right up to the cabin and left without a sound. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. I had 4 days left. I told myself it was just a bear, maybe a moose, nothing to panic about. But the next night, I woke up to a noise that chilled me to the bone. It was the sound of breathing, not my own. It was deep, ragged, and it was coming from just outside the wall near my bed. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. It lasted for about 10 minutes, then stopped. I stayed frozen for another hour before I could finally move. When I looked outside, there was nothing there, but the tracks were back. More of them. By the 5th day, I was done pretending everything was fine. I packed my bag, left most of the supplies behind, and started the hike back to my truck. I kept the revolver in my hand the whole way. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no wind, no nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the ground. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed something. One of the red tape markers on a tree was gone. Then another. Then another. Someone or something had removed them. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but I started to feel lost. The trees all looked the same. I couldn't tell if I was going the right way anymore. After another hour, I found a tree with a fresh mark on it, but it wasn't my tape. It was a scratch, deep and jagged, like something with claws had raked it. There were more of them on nearby trees, forming a crude path that led off into the woods. I didn't follow it. I turned in the opposite direction and ran. It took me the rest of the day to finally find the dirt road. I stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and dehydrated. When I reached my truck, I locked the doors, started it up, and didn't stop driving until I hit the next town. I never went back to that cabin. I never contacted the owner. I just left it all behind. A few months later, I tried to find the listing again, just to see if anyone else had rented it, but it was gone. No trace of it online, no record of the property. I still don't know what I saw out there. I don't know what was in those woods with me. All I know is it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before. It followed me, it watched me, and it wanted me gone. I haven't been in the woods since. I don't think I ever will again. I've always been drawn to places that most people avoid. Remote areas, deep forests, quiet spots where the wind seems louder than civilization. Places that don't show up on tourist maps. I used to tell myself I loved the peace, the freedom, the fresh air. But after what happened in the fall of 2022, I've stopped going into the woods. I sold all my gear. I don't hike. I don't fish. I don't even walk near the treeline anymore, because I can't shake the feeling that someone's still watching me. It started with a cabin I rented for 2 weeks. I was burned out. Work had been draining me, and I needed time to reset. I found the cabin listed online. A small wooden structure in a part of Montana I'd never been to before. The photos looked perfect. Surrounded by tall pine trees, miles away from the nearest town. No neighbors, no noise, no internet. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed light, just some clothes, food, water, a few books, my hunting knife, and a bolt-action rifle I kept for protection when staying in wild areas. I also brought a generator and a satellite phone just in case. I drove up early one Saturday morning and reached the edge of the forest before noon. From there, it was another hour on a narrow dirt road that wound through thick woods. The road was rough, and I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was even better than I expected. small but solid. Wooden walls with a stone chimney, a wraparound porch, a small shed off to the side. Inside, there was a fireplace, a small kitchen, a single bed, and a couple of chairs. No television, no distractions, just what I needed. That first day was uneventful. I unpacked, walked the area, and got a feel for the land. There was a creek nearby and an old game trail that led deeper into the woods. The air smelled clean. The sun filtered through the trees, and I felt calmer than I had in months. I made dinner, lit a fire, and read until the light faded. That night, I slept like a rock. The second day was when things began to feel off. Started small, nothing you'd notice right away. I went out early, around 7 a.m., to follow the trail I'd found the day before. I brought my rifle, a bottle of water, and some jerky. I didn't plan to go far, just wanted to explore. A couple miles in, I found footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from the previous day, but they were too fresh. The edges were crisp, no debris inside. Someone had been on the trail after I came through. They were boot prints about the same size as mine, but the stride was slightly longer. I looked around, but the woods were quiet. I followed the trail for another half-mile before heading back. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Could have been a hunter or someone else camping in the area. Sure, but the listing for the cabin had said it was private land. That night, I locked the door, loaded my rifle, and kept it beside me. On the third day, I found something that made my stomach turn. I went outside to gather firewood around noon and saw a rabbit hanging from a tree branch near the shed. Its throat had been slit cleanly, and it was strung up by its hind legs with twine. I didn't put it there. I stood staring at it for a while, trying to figure out why someone would do that. Maybe it was meant as bait, but there was no trap nearby. I took it down and buried it. That night, I sat in the cabin with all the windows closed. Even though it was warm, I kept the rifle in my lap. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound outside made my heart jump. On the fourth day, I hiked back to the truck. It was a long walk, but I needed to check that everything was still where I left it. I hadn't used it since arriving. When I got there, I saw that someone had tried to open the driver's side door. There were scratches around the lock, and the side mirror had been snapped clean off. I felt cold all over. This wasn't random. Someone knew I was here. I didn't have any cell signal, but the satellite phone still worked. I thought about calling someone, reporting it, but I didn't have much to say. No one had harmed me. There was no clear crime, just weird stuff. Still, I kept the phone with me from then on. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to stay dark and quiet. I ate cold food and sat near the window watching the tree lean. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, steady. I froze, every part of me tense. The steps moved around the cabin. I could hear them shifting from one side to the other, as if whoever it was circling me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. Right by the wall behind me, I raised my rifle and aimed at the door, but nothing happened. No knock, no voice, just silence. After a while, the sound stopped. I waited hours before I finally dozed off. The next morning, I checked outside. No footprints, no signs of anyone, but I found something else. On the porch, near the chair I liked to sit in, someone had carved something into the wood. Just a single word. Leave. The cuts were fresh. Splinters still clung to the grooves. I ran my hand over it and felt the sharp edges. It hadn't been there yesterday. I knew that for sure. At that point, I should have left. I should have packed my stuff and walked back to the truck. But I didn't. Part of it was stubbornness. I paid for 2 weeks. I wanted my time. I didn't want to be scared off like a child. And part of me thought maybe it was just some drifter messing around. Maybe if I stayed inside, locked everything up, they'd get bored and move on. I was wrong. That night, it got worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the back window creaking. I hadn't opened that window once. I grabbed the rifle, moved as quietly as I could, and stood in the hallway. I could hear something sliding against the glass. Then a soft thud, like someone testing the frame. I didn't move. I just waited. my heart beating so fast I thought I might pass out. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed there until dawn. When I checked the window in the morning, I saw faint fingerprints on the glass. Long, smudged streaks, not from gloves, bare hands. That was the final straw. I packed my things, loaded the rifle, and left. I didn't even stop to eat. I walked fast and never looked back. When I reached the truck, I checked the back seat and bed before getting in. Everything looked normal. I drove away fast, pushing the truck harder than I should have on that dirt road. The trees seemed to close in tighter as I went, like they were trying to keep me there. But I made it out. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He sounded calm, asked how my stay was. I told him I'd left early, told him about the damage to the truck, the rabbit, the noises. I didn't mention the word on the porch. He paused and then said, almost casually, that sometimes hunters wander through even though it's private land. Said he'd install some new locks. I didn't reply. A month after that, I was scrolling online and saw a news article about that same stretch of woods. Hiker had gone missing, last seen near the same trail I walked. They never found him. I think about that all the time now. When I close my eyes, I still hear those footsteps. I still see that rabbit swinging from the tree. I still feel like someone's watching. I live in the city now. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I keep the satellite phone in a drawer, just in case. I still check my locks twice every night, and I haven't rented another cabin. I never will, because the truth is, it wasn't a ghost or a monster that scared me. It was a man, a real person, someone who knew the land better than I did, someone who watched me from the trees, someone who waited. And the scariest part? I don't know how long he was out there before I noticed, and I don't know if he ever left. It was mid-October when I decided to take a break from everything. My job had been eating me alive. The city noise had started to sound like a constant buzzing in my skull, and even scrolling on my phone felt like a chore. I needed to get away alone. I found this cabin on a rental site that was buried in the woods of northern Montana, about 3 miles from the nearest road. There were no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no signal, no anything. That was the whole point. I packed light, just food, warm clothes, a hunting knife, a flashlight, my phone, mostly useless out there, and a thick paperback I hadn't had time to read in months. The drive took most of the day. I remember the last half hour being on a narrow dirt road that curved through thick pine trees and dipped into small valleys. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. Simple, one-story, old but sturdy, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked on the side. It was quiet, so quiet that even closing my car door sounded too loud. The first night was fine. I made a fire, cooked something simple, and sat outside until the cold chased me back in. The sky was full of stars. I don't remember the last time I saw that many. I read for a while, then went to bed. The mattress was stiff, but I didn't care. I was out cold within minutes. The next day, I explored the area. There was a small creek not far behind the cabin and a trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I followed it for a while but turned back when the wind picked up and made the trees creak. That sound always gets under my skin. Back at the cabin, I stacked more wood inside, boiled water for tea, and tried to settle into the silence. That night, I thought I heard something outside around 2 a.m. It was faint, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I sat up, held my breath, and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Every small sound seemed bigger, closer. The wind made the walls pop and groan, and once I thought I heard something brush against the window. I stayed in bed, eyes wide open, until it was light again. The next day, I felt stupid for letting my imagination get to me. I grabbed the axe beside the woodpile and decided to cut some logs. It helped. Physical work always did. Afterward, I hiked a little further out from the cabin. Not too far, just enough to get some space. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. That night, the sounds came back. This time, they were clearer. A footstep, then another, then nothing. I sat on the floor inside with the lights off and waited. I wanted to catch whoever it was off guard. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost. But nothing happened. I stayed like that for at least an hour before finally getting back into bed. The morning after, I found something. Near the back of the cabin, about 15 feet out, I saw shoe prints. They weren't mine. I had been wearing thick hiking boots with a very specific tread. These were smaller, smoother, like worn sneakers or something. They were fresh. The dirt was still soft from last night's light rain. I followed them a little ways, but they just stopped near the tree line. No sign of where they came from or where they went. I felt that weird pressure in my chest, like something was just barely out of reach, like something wasn't right. I didn't have signal, so I couldn't call anyone. I thought about leaving early, but the idea of walking 3 miles through dense woods with someone possibly watching me made me stay. At least in the cabin, I had walls. I started locking the door at all times. I moved one of the heavy chairs against it when I was inside. At night, I put a few small pans on the porch steps so I'd hear if anyone came up. I didn't sleep much. 2 nights later, around 3 a.m., I heard the pans rattle. I jumped out of bed, heart slamming. I didn't turn on any lights. I grabbed the flashlight and the hunting knife and slowly moved toward the door. The chair was still wedged against it. I waited. 10 minutes, then 20. No more sounds. Finally, I opened the door and shined the light outside. Nothing. But one of the pans had been moved. Just slightly, like someone had nudged it with their foot. The woods were too dark to see far. I waited until the sun came up before I stepped outside. I didn't see any new prints, just the same ones as before. I walked the perimeter again. I was starting to feel watched even in daylight. That day, I kept the axe nearby. I barely ate. I sat inside and listened. The forest was dead silent, which somehow made it worse. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. I just waited. As night fell, I didn't turn any lights on. I sat on the floor again, back against the wall, axe beside me, waiting for anything. Hours passed. Nothing. Then I heard something that I will never forget. It was the sound of my car door closing. I froze. It was unmistakable. That solid metal thunk. My car was parked about 50 feet from the cabin, in a little clearing off the dirt trail. I didn't move. I just listened. A minute later, I heard the engine try to turn over. Once, twice, then silence. I hadn't left the keys in the car. I remembered that clearly. I had put them in the drawer by the sink, just a habit. Slowly, I crawled to the window. I lifted the edge of the curtain just a bit. The car was still there. Lights off. No one inside. I waited till morning. When I stepped outside, everything looked normal. But the driver's side door was open. The seat was pushed back, and there was mud on the floor mat that wasn't there before. I ran inside, grabbed the keys from the drawer, and started the car. It worked fine. I considered driving out right then, but I was afraid I'd run into someone on the narrow trail. If they were out there, they could block the path or worse. I decided to wait until midday, when the sun was high and visibility was good. I packed everything, every piece of food, every tool. I kept the knife in my lap and the axe on the passenger seat. I started driving slow and steady. Every turn, every shadow between the trees made me tighten my grip on the wheel. It took almost an hour to reach the main road. When I got there, I didn't stop. I drove until I reached a town, then parked at a gas station and sat there for nearly 30 minutes before I could speak to anyone. I didn't report it. What would I say? That someone might have been watching me in the woods? That they tried to get into my car? There was no proof, no footage, no damage. I never went back. I never used that rental site again. I still don't know what was really going on out there. Maybe someone was squatting nearby. Maybe they watched the cabin regularly. Maybe they were just messing with me. But it felt more personal than that. Like I was being tested. Or studied. Like someone knew I was out there alone and wanted to see what I would do. To this day, I keep my doors locked. I check my windows before I sleep. And I never go into the woods alone anymore. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear the sound of that car door closing. It was early November when I decided to take some time off from work and head up to a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I had been feeling burnt out for weeks. The idea of no phone calls, no emails, no city noise sounded perfect. The cabin was small, remote, and tucked into a thick forest about 30 minutes from the nearest town. I found it listed on a forum where people shared lesser-known getaway spots. The pictures looked decent, simple but clean, the kind of place where you could just sit and hear nothing but wind and birds. The drive there was long. I left before sunrise, hoping to reach before dark. After passing through the last stretch of paved road, I turned onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. The trees grew tighter as I got deeper in. The road was uneven, and I could hear branches scraping under the car. I didn't pass a single other car for over an hour. My cell signal dropped shortly after that. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just how I expected. One story, wood-sided, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked against one wall. It had a tin roof that rattled slightly in the wind. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a bed, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area with an old gas stove. No TV, no internet, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bathroom was a tiny room off the side, with an old-fashioned toilet and a hand pump sink. There was no shower. I had brought bottled water, food, a flashlight, and enough firewood for the stove to last several days. The first night was calm. I made a fire, cooked some soup, and sat on the porch with a blanket. The forest around me was silent, too silent. I realized how much background noise I was used to. At one point, I thought I heard something move in the trees, but I figured it was probably just a raccoon. I went inside, locked the door, and went to sleep. The second day, I spent hiking a small trail that looped about 2 miles through the woods behind the cabin. I saw deer tracks, a squirrel, and not much else. The air was cold but clean. I felt good. My shoulders weren't tight anymore. That evening, I started to notice something. There were no birds. Not just that I didn't see them. I didn't hear them. Even squirrels that were there earlier seemed to be gone. The forest felt empty. That night, I heard something outside around 1 a.m. I was asleep but woke up to a dull thump. It wasn't loud, but enough to make me sit up. I stayed in bed for a minute, listening. Then I heard another sound. This one was a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the porch. Stopped, then started again. I got up slowly, heart pounding. I had brought a hunting knife with me. I grabbed it and crept to the window. It was too dark to see much outside, so I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it through the glass. Nothing, just the woodpile and empty porch. I told myself it could have been a branch falling or a raccoon dragging something. I forced myself back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I saw long marks on the porch, faint but visible. They looked like something heavy had been pulled across it. I checked the woods around the cabin, but didn't see anything strange. Still, I was on edge. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the fire going and sat inside, reading an old paperback I'd brought. Later that afternoon, while outside gathering kindling, I heard a sharp crack in the woods. Not far, like a branch snapping. I froze. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound but saw nothing. No wind, no animals. Just that awful silence again. I went back inside and locked the door early that night. That night, it got worse. I was half asleep when I heard what sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate ones. On the porch again. My heart jumped into my throat. The steps stopped near the window. Then I heard a scratching. Not nails. Something harder, like metal scraping wood. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until morning, knife in hand. When daylight came, I checked outside. More marks on the porch. Some scratches on the doorframe. They were low, like at knee height. I couldn't figure out what made them. There were no footprints, just leaves. I thought about leaving, but the road was narrow and rough, and I didn't want to drive it half asleep. I decided I'd leave the next morning. That day felt long. Every sound made me jump. I didn't cook. I didn't go outside. I just sat in the cabin and waited. Around 5 p.m., I heard something hit the side of the cabin, hard. Then another thud. I stood and listened. Nothing after that. But when I checked, there were fresh dents on the siding, like something had been thrown. But there was nothing on the ground around them. I barely slept. I kept the fire going, hoping it might scare anything off. At some point during the night, the light bulb went out. I still had the flashlight, so I used it, but it made me feel more exposed. Around 3 a.m., I heard scratching again, this time around the back wall. I didn't move. The sound came and went for about 10 minutes, then stopped. When the sun rose, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat breakfast. I just got in the car and drove. That dirt road felt longer than ever. Every shadow between the trees felt like something watching. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. Back in town, I told the man at the gas station about the cabin. He said he knew of it, said it had been there for decades. When I mentioned the noises and marks, he looked at me for a second too long, then just said the woods get weird in the fall. I went home and didn't talk about it for weeks. Then, one night, I opened my bag and found something I didn't pack. It was a piece of wood, about the size of my hand, old, dry, and carved with 3 short lines across it, like a tally mark. I didn't know what it meant. I threw it out. I haven't gone back since. I don't plan to. Whatever was out there wasn't a ghost or monster, but it was real. I don't know if someone was watching me, or if it was just the forest playing tricks on my mind after being alone too long. But the sounds, the marks, and that carved piece of wood, they weren't my imagination. Next time I need to get away, I'll stay at a hotel, with people, and lights. It started as a break I desperately needed. I had been working non-stop for over a year without any real time off. The stress had built up slowly. Tight shoulders, sleepless nights, headaches that wouldn't go away. I felt like I was running on empty. A friend of mine mentioned an old family cabin up north that no one had used in years. It was quiet, in the woods, and far from any towns or people. That sounded perfect to me. The drive took nearly 8 hours. The last 2 were through winding, tree-lined roads that kept getting narrower the farther I drove. By the time I reached the small gravel path leading to the cabin, my phone had lost all signal. I didn't mind. I had planned for that. I wanted isolation. No emails, no calls, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the silence. The cabin sat about 100 yards off the gravel path, surrounded by tall pines. It was old, but sturdy. The roof sagged a little, and the front porch creaked under my weight, but everything seemed solid. I unlocked the door with the key my friend had mailed me, pushed it open, and walked into stale air that smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. Inside, there was a small kitchen to the left with an old gas stove and a sink that didn't look like it had been used in a long time. To the right was a living area with a couch, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove for heat. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom and 1 bedroom. The place was simple, quiet, and exactly what I wanted. I spent the first day cleaning. I opened all the windows, swept the floors, wiped down the counters, and shook out the musty bedding. I unpacked my supplies, filled the cabinets with the canned food and dry goods I brought, and stacked some wood near the stove. That night, I made a simple meal and sat by the fire with a book until I fell asleep on the couch. The first few days passed peacefully. I went on walks through the woods, read, cooked simple meals, and just let my body relax. I didn't check the time often, and I went to bed when I was tired. I hadn't felt that calm in years. My only issue was the lack of running water. The plumbing didn't seem to work. I had to walk down to a nearby creek to collect water in buckets. It was a bit of a chore, but it felt good to do something physical. On the 5th day, things started to feel different. It was small at first. I noticed the front door was open one morning, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. I told myself maybe I hadn't latched it properly. It was an old door, and the wind could have pushed it open. That same night, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I looked outside with my flashlight, nothing was there. The next morning, I found one of my water buckets knocked over. There were drag marks in the dirt, like it had been pulled a few feet and tipped. Again, I tried to reason it away. Maybe an animal came by, raccoons or something, but I hadn't seen any animals around the cabin since I arrived. No deer, no birds, no squirrels. The woods were oddly quiet. I started to get uneasy. I began double-checking the locks before bed, placing chairs under the doorknob, and keeping a fire poker next to me while I slept. At night, I kept waking up, not because of sounds, but because of a feeling, like someone was watching me, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but it stuck with me. One morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt near the creek. They were human, barefoot, and fresh. They led down to the water and disappeared. I looked around for a long time, but I saw no one. I stood completely still for at least 15 minutes, listening for anything. Nothing. No birds, no bugs, just a dead, heavy silence that wrapped around me like fog. I stopped going to the creek unless it was bright daylight. Even then, I carried a hatchet with me and kept looking over my shoulder. I started using less water just so I wouldn't have to go down there often. I washed less, cooked less, and tried not to stay outside after the sun went down. Then I started hearing noises at night, not just footsteps, more than that. Once, I heard something tapping on the windows, slow, steady taps that circled the cabin, moving from one side to the next. I stayed on the couch with the fire poker in my hand, frozen, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I didn't go near the windows. I didn't look out. The next morning, I found smudges on the glass, greasy, finger-shaped marks. On every window, I considered leaving. I even packed a bag. But the thought of driving down those narrow roads at night scared me more than staying. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone messing around. Some local who knew the cabin was empty and decided to scare me. But why? No one should have even known I was there. 3 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the front door opening. Not creaking, not slamming, just opening. A quiet, smooth motion like someone had turned the knob slowly and pushed it wide. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened. Nothing happened for maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard soft, light steps on the wooden floor. They moved across the room slowly, then stopped, right in front of the couch. I stayed as still as I could. My back was to the room. I had fallen asleep facing the fire. I waited, listening. My skin crawled. I felt sweat roll down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't turn around. I didn't even dare to blink too hard. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again. They backed away, slowly, toward the door. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky turned gray with morning light, I got up and checked. The front door was wide open. The chairs I had placed under the knob were stacked neatly on the porch. I locked the door and pushed a heavy table in front of it. I nailed boards over the windows using some old planks I found behind the shed. I didn't go outside. I didn't eat. I just waited. That night, there were no sounds, no taps, no footsteps, nothing. But that scared me even more, because I knew something was coming. The next morning, I saw smoke in the woods, a thin line of it rising from somewhere deeper in the trees. It looked far, but not too far. I didn't know what to do. I waited for hours, watching it through a crack in the boards. Eventually, it stopped. But that night, I smelled it. Smoke, faint, drifting into the cabin like it was coming through the walls. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, clutching the fire poker, staring at the boarded-up windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop at the windows. They circled the cabin twice. Then something pressed against the back door. Not hitting it, just pressing. The wood creaked slightly, then silence. At dawn, I found a dead rabbit nailed to the door. Its insides were gone. The nails were long, rusty, and bent. I threw up in the bushes and cried. I didn't care if it was dangerous to drive. I packed everything in 10 minutes, got in my car, and left. The drive out was long and tense. Every shadow between the trees felt like someone watching. Every turn felt like a trap. But nothing happened. I didn't see anyone. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I never told my friend what happened. I just said the cabin was too remote and that I needed to be around people. I didn't return any of the borrowed supplies. I changed my number a few months later. It's been almost a year. I still have dreams about that place. Not about what I saw, because I never really saw anything, but about what I felt. That deep, crawling fear. That certainty that I wasn't alone. That someone or something was waiting just out of sight. I still don't know who it was, or what they wanted. But I know this, they were real. As real as the boards I nailed to the windows, the footprints by the creek, and the smell of smoke in my clothes when I got home. Real enough that I will never go back to the woods alone again. It was late September when I decided to take a break from work and get away from the city. I had been burned out from long hours, meetings, and endless emails. I wanted silence, trees, maybe a lake. I wanted to feel something different than the pressure of deadlines and city noise. So I looked up cabins for rent far away from everything and ended up booking one about 6 hours north of where I lived. It was deep in the woods near an old logging road. The ad said there was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and that the nearest town was almost an hour away. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was long and tiring. The last 2 hours were on rough, uneven dirt roads that twisted through thick woods. My phone lost signal about 45 minutes before I arrived. There were no houses, no people, just trees, rocks, and an occasional deer crossing the road. The sun was already starting to go down by the time I got to the cabin. The place looked exactly like the pictures. It was small, one floor, built out of old wood that had darkened from years of weather. It sat on a hill that sloped down into a thick forest. Behind it, maybe a 10-minute walk through the trees, was a lake. The porch had a rocking chair and an old firewood bin. The inside had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. The windows were wide and clear, and when I stood by them, all I could see were trees. There was no TV, no microwave, just silence and the sound of wind in the trees. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my bags, lit a fire, and sat on the porch with a book. I fell asleep early. The bed was comfortable and the silence was deep. No sirens, no voices, not even a car in the distance. Just wind and the occasional creak of the wood walls. The second day, I walked to the lake. The path was narrow and covered in dead leaves. Birds flew overhead. The lake was calm, untouched, and cold. I sat there for a while, skipping stones, breathing the fresh air. On the way back, I noticed an old tree stump with a strange pattern carved into it. It looked like some kind of mark. Not letters, not numbers, just deep scratches, almost like a spiral but rough and uneven. I figured it was probably old. Maybe kids had messed around out here at some point. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. No sound, just that heavy kind of silence that feels too quiet. I got up to use the bathroom, and as I passed the living room window, I stopped. I felt something, like I was being watched. I looked outside. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I stood there a while, staring. Nothing moved. I went back to bed. On the third day, I went for a longer walk. I followed the path past the lake and deeper into the woods. I didn't bring a map because I figured I could follow the same trail back. After maybe an hour of walking, I came across a small clearing. In the middle of it was a collapsed wooden structure, maybe an old hunting shack. It was mostly rotted, the roof caved in, the walls falling apart. I stepped closer to look inside. There were old beer cans, broken wood, and a pile of clothes. Not modern clothes. They looked old, dirty, like they'd been sitting there for years. A thick jacket, torn pants, muddy boots. I didn't want to touch anything, but it felt strange, like whoever left them never came back for them. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard a sound behind me. Just a small crack, like a branch breaking. I froze, listened. Nothing, just wind. I looked around. No animals, no movement. But I still felt that same thing as the night before, like I was being watched. I walked fast on the way back, keeping an eye on the trees around me. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and shut all the windows. I felt a little ridiculous, but something didn't feel right. I kept trying to brush it off. Told myself I was just not used to being in the woods alone. I made dinner, read my book, and tried to calm down. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, I woke up again. Same time, 2 a.m. This time, I heard something. A soft tap. Then another, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I stayed in bed, listening. Came again. Tap, tap, tap. I got up slowly and went to the living room window. I moved the curtain just slightly and looked out. There was nothing there. I waited. Still nothing. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. Cold wind, trees, silence. I stood there for a minute. Then, just before I went back in, I thought I saw something far off between the trees. It looked like a shape, person, not moving, just standing there. I stared at it, but the longer I looked, the more it just looked like a shadow or a tree stump. I wasn't sure. I closed the door, locked it, and stayed in the bedroom the rest of the night. The next day, I told myself I needed to cut the trip short. I was getting too paranoid. Maybe I was just overthinking everything, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I packed most of my stuff and planned to leave first thing the next morning. I didn't go out that day. I stayed inside, double-checking the windows and doors, listening to every creak and gust of wind. Late that afternoon, I heard something again. This time, it was footsteps on the porch. I turned off all the lights and stood quietly near the front of the cabin. The steps were soft, slow. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, after maybe a full minute, they stopped. I waited. Nothing. After another few minutes, I slowly opened the front door. No one. But on the wood of the porch, I saw footprints. Muddy, spaced apart like someone had walked right up to the door. The prints weren't mine. I hadn't been outside all day. They were fresh. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a fire going, watching the front door. I had a heavy flashlight and a knife from the kitchen, just in case. Around 3 a.m., the fire had died down and the cabin was dark and cold. I started to nod off, but a sound woke me. The back door. The door that led to the woods behind the cabin. I knew I had locked it. I got up slowly, moved toward the back of the cabin, and listened. The doorknob was turning, gently, slowly, like someone was testing it. Then it stopped. I stood there in the dark, waiting for the sound again. After a few minutes, I heard soft footsteps on the leaves outside, moving away. I stayed up until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I packed everything. I threw my bags in the car and didn't even bother cleaning up. I didn't look back. I drove fast down the dirt road, bouncing over rocks and potholes. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. When I got back to town, I called the owner of the cabin and told him something wasn't right. I didn't go into full detail, just said I thought someone had been snooping around the cabin. He sounded surprised and said no one should be out there, that it was private land. I don't know what really happened. I don't know if it was some drifter, some hunter, or just a person who lived nearby. But I do know that I saw footprints, I heard the doors being tested, and I felt watched the entire time. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a story. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I canceled a future cabin trip I had planned for the winter. I still think about that place a lot. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night, or if I had opened the back door, or if I had gotten lost deeper in the woods. The feeling never really left me, stuck with me for months. Even now, when I walk at night or hear a noise outside my house, I think about that cabin. I think about the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, and I always make sure every door and window in my home is locked tight before I go to sleep. I needed to get away from everything. I had taken a break from work, shut off my phone, and packed up enough food, water, and supplies for a week. I rented a cabin way out in the woods of northern Maine. Something remote, with no cell service, no internet, and definitely no neighbors. I wanted to clear my head and be alone for a while. The cabin was listed on a barely used local rental site, and the guy who owned it lived in another town. He left the key in a lockbox by the door. It all felt simple enough. The drive there was long. After about 6 hours of highway and another hour of rough back roads, I finally reached the dirt trail that led up to the cabin. That last stretch of the drive was the roughest. It was barely a road, just 2 faded tire tracks surrounded by thick pine trees. I had to drive real slow to avoid damaging the undercarriage of my car. Branches scraped against the windows, and at times I wasn't even sure I was still on the path. But eventually, I saw the edge of a roof peeking through the trees. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined. Old, wooden, with a small front porch and a tin chimney. There was a single solar panel tilted toward the sun, and a small, rusted propane tank behind the building. I parked the car, got out, stretched my legs, and just stood there for a few minutes. Everything was quiet. There were no planes overhead, no cars in the distance, no people. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Inside the cabin was even simpler than the outside. There was one main room with a small bed pushed against the far wall, a table and 2 chairs, a wood stove for heat, and a kitchenette with a small propane stove. The bathroom was in a tiny back room and had a composting toilet. No running water, just jugs that I'd brought with me. It was dusty but clean. There were no signs anyone had been there in months. I unpacked my supplies, made a small meal, and settled in. That first night was peaceful. I lit a few candles, sat by the stove, and read a book until I fell asleep. The air was cold, but the sleeping bag kept me warm. The next few days passed slowly. I spent most of the time hiking nearby trails, chopping firewood, cooking simple meals, and just sitting on the porch listening to the sounds of the forest. I was starting to feel a little more relaxed. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there, and the isolation was just what I needed. But that feeling didn't last. On the 4th night, I woke up suddenly. It was dead quiet, and something felt off. I didn't know why I woke up, but I felt wide awake. I sat there in the dark, listening. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was cold. I thought maybe I heard something outside. It wasn't clear, just a faint crunch, like someone stepping on old leaves or snow. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see any tracks, but the ground was hard and dry. I tried to forget about it. I made breakfast and went for a long hike, but the whole time I felt like something was behind me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing. That night, I barricaded the door with a heavy chair and moved the table in front of it. I didn't know why. I just felt better doing it. I also put my hatchet next to the bed. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time it was louder. Footsteps, slow, careful, right outside the cabin. Then a scraping sound, like something brushing against the wood siding. I sat up, heart pounding, and didn't move. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then nothing. When the sun came up, I rushed outside. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything. I thought maybe I was losing it. Maybe the isolation was messing with my head. But the next night, it got worse. Around the same time, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop. They moved back and forth outside the cabin, like someone pacing. Then something tapped the window, just once, then again. I didn't have curtains, so I stayed low on the bed, barely breathing. I waited like that until the sky started to lighten. I ran outside the moment it was bright enough to see. Again, no footprints, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The lockbox on the front door was open. The key was gone. That's when I decided to leave. I packed everything in a rush, threw it into the car, and started driving down the dirt path. I made it maybe 200 feet before I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the trail. It hadn't been there before. I got out and looked at it. It wasn't huge, but big enough to block my car. It looked like it had been cut, not naturally fallen. The base was clean, like someone had used a saw. I didn't hear any chainsaws the night before, and the tree didn't look dead. Someone had done this. Someone didn't want me leaving. I kept my hatchet in hand and started walking back to the cabin. I figured I could wait until daylight and try to move the tree or maybe find another way out. I didn't want to stay the night, but I didn't have a choice. When I got back to the cabin, the door was open. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't just stand out there either. I crept in slowly. Everything looked normal at first. Then I saw it. The chair I had used to block the door was broken. One of the legs snapped off and lying across the floor. My sleeping bag was unzipped and crumpled in the corner. On the table, there was a single item that didn't belong to me. A torn piece of flannel cloth, red and black with a faded tag on it. I hadn't packed anything like that. I stayed awake the whole night with the hatchet in my hands, watching the windows and the door. I didn't hear anything else. No more footsteps, no tapping, nothing. When the sun rose, I went back to the tree on the trail. This time I didn't waste any time. I chopped off enough small branches to lighten it and then dragged it off the path bit by bit. Took hours. My hands were blistered and raw by the time I cleared enough room to drive through. I didn't even go back to get the rest of my things. I just got in the car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove straight to a diner in the next town, parked, and sat there for almost 30 minutes just trying to calm down. I finally turned my phone back on and called a friend. I told him I was coming back early. I didn't tell him why. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the incident to the rental site and told them what happened, but I never got a reply. The listing disappeared a few days later. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know someone had been watching me. Someone who knew the woods. Someone who waited until the middle of the night to come close. Sometimes I still think about the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin, slow and quiet, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I had been needing a break from everything for a while. Work had been eating me alive. My sleep was barely 3 hours a night, and my nerves were always on edge. Every little noise made me jump. I knew I needed to get away, and not just for a weekend. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, with no traffic, no buzzing phone, and no people. So I rented a small cabin in the woods of northern Michigan for 2 weeks. It was a simple one-room place about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, nestled in thick forest with no neighbors in sight. No electricity, no cell signal, and only a wood stove for heat. The kind of isolation I thought I needed. I packed the basics: canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, matches, flashlights, and a hunting knife I always carried when I hiked. I didn't bring any books, music, or electronics. I wanted to clear my head, not distract it. The first 2 days went by quietly. I spent most of the time walking around the woods, getting familiar with the area, collecting wood, and trying to enjoy the silence. The cabin was old but in decent shape. The front door had a rusty latch, and the windows were dirty but intact. There were scratch marks on the outside walls, probably from animals. Inside, it was bare bones. Just a cot, a table, and an old chair that creaked every time I sat in it. The forest around the cabin was dense. The trees were tall and packed tightly together. I followed some deer trails during the day and even came across a small creek not far from the cabin. It was peaceful out there, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to check a clock. On the third night, I was sitting by the fire inside the cabin when I thought I heard something outside. A branch snapping. It wasn't the wind. I knew that sound well. This was sharp, like something stepping on dry twigs. I froze, listening. The fire popped and cracked behind me. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, before I went to sleep, I checked the latch on the door 3 times and moved the cot a little closer to the fireplace. The cabin walls were thin, and I could hear every gust of wind, every rustle in the trees. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. There were boot prints in the dirt behind the cabin. Not hiking boots or sneakers, these were heavy, deep prints like work boots, and they were fresh. The ground was still soft from rain the night before, and the edges of the prints were sharp and clear. They weren't mine. I always walked with a slight drag on my left foot because of an old ankle injury. These prints were even, straight, and led from the forest line straight up to the back wall of the cabin. Then they turned and disappeared around the side. I followed them carefully. They went past the side window and stopped right at the front door. Then they just vanished. No returning tracks. No prints heading back into the woods. I looked around. The trees were quiet. The air was still. There was no one in sight. I didn't know what to think. It made no sense. Maybe someone had come during the night, checked the cabin, then walked back on their same steps. But if they had, they were quiet enough not to wake me, and careful enough to leave no trace on the way back. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had stood at the front door just watching me through the window. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed in for most of the day. I listened for footsteps, voices, anything, but there was nothing. By nightfall, I had calmed myself down enough to light the fireplace again and eat a little. Still, I barely slept that night. I kept the hunting knife close and stayed awake, staring at the window. The fourth day started off quiet, but I felt different. I wasn't relaxed anymore. I kept glancing at the trees when I went outside. I felt watched. I walked out to the creek just to clear my head. That's when I noticed something else. There was a small pile of stones stacked on the trail. I hadn't seen them before. It was a cone-shaped stack, about a foot high, made of 5 or 6 round stones. Not natural, not something animals would do. I looked around again, feeling that itch in the back of my neck. I kicked the pile over and walked back to the cabin faster than usual. I didn't go back outside the rest of the day. That night, I kept the fire low and the lights off. I lay on the cot, fully clothed, with the knife still in my hand. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, steps outside. This time it was clearer, crunching leaves, something moving slowly. Then it stopped, right at the front door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the door. The fire was down to embers. The air inside was cold. I heard the wood creak on the porch, a single soft sound, then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly and looked around. The same boot prints were there, but this time there were more. Several sets, circling the cabin. Some were larger, some smaller. I walked around the whole cabin. It looked like at least 3 people had come up in the night and walked circles around it, then disappeared. No tire tracks, no voices, no gear, just the prints. That was the first time I seriously thought about leaving. But I didn't. I was too stubborn. I told myself maybe it was a local thing, some hunters messing around. I didn't want to look like an idiot going home early over footprints. Still, I didn't sleep the next night. The 6th day it rained hard. I stayed inside all day. No movement, just the sound of rain on the metal roof. I hoped it would wash away whatever had been around. But that night, just past midnight, I heard it again. First a soft knock, then another. Not loud, not banging, just gentle taps. It was coming from the side window. I didn't move. I sat up slowly and stared into the darkness. The tapping continued for about 5 minutes, then stopped. I didn't go check. In the morning, I finally found the courage to go outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and still. I walked to the side window. There were 3 small smudges on the glass, fingerprints, and right below them on the dirt were 2 deep footprints, standing still, facing the window. That's when I decided I was done. I packed everything I could carry and made a plan to hike back to the road the next morning and call for help or a ride. There was no way I was spending another night there. I didn't start the fire that night. I didn't sleep either. I sat by the door with the knife and waited. I wanted to make it to daylight. Around 2 a.m., I heard something scrape the wood outside. Not footsteps, not tapping, scraping, like metal on wood. It moved slowly around the cabin. I held my breath and waited, gripping the knife so hard my hand went numb. Then the door latch jiggled, just once, then silence again. When the morning came, I opened the door and ran. I didn't look back. I followed the trail as fast as I could, not stopping for anything. I hiked the full 5 miles in under 2 hours. When I reached the road, I finally took a breath. I flagged down a passing truck and asked to be dropped at the nearest ranger station. I didn't tell them the full story, just said I had seen people on the property and didn't feel safe. They sent someone out to check the cabin. I never heard what they found. I didn't want to know. I went home the next day. Weeks later, I still couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those prints, the finger smudges, the tapping, the sound of the latch. I thought maybe it was a group of squatters or people living out there off the grid. But the quiet way they moved, the way they vanished without a trace, it didn't add up. It wasn't some horror movie story. There were no monsters or demons, just real people doing something I didn't understand. And to me, that was even worse. Taught me something too. Silence doesn't always mean safety. And some places are quiet because something doesn't want to be found. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I never will again. It was the middle of October when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin in the northern woods of Minnesota. I'd rented it online. The listing had a few photos showing a small, wooden structure tucked into dense trees near a lake. It looked peaceful and isolated, just what I was looking for. After months of working long hours and barely sleeping, I needed the break. I told a few people where I was going, packed enough food and clothes for a week, and made the long drive north. The road turned from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. My tires kicked up dust as I drove deeper into the woods. The GPS kept recalculating, and eventually I lost signal. I had already downloaded the map offline, so I wasn't too worried. Still, the last few miles made me uneasy. The trees were thick, taller than telephone poles, and they leaned over the narrow path like they were closing in. My SUV bounced along ruts and rocks, branches brushed against the windows, and when I finally reached the cabin, I realized how truly alone I was. The cabin was older than I expected. The pictures must have been taken years ago. The wood siding was weathered gray and had moss growing in spots. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The front door opened with a loud groan. Inside, it smelled like old pine, dust, and damp wood. It was small, just one room with a bed, a small table, a fireplace, and a kitchenette. There was a bathroom with a compost toilet and a solar-powered shower. There wasn't any electricity except for a couple solar lights. I didn't mind. I just wanted quiet. I spent the first day unloading my stuff, getting the firewood stacked, checking the water tank, and making sure everything worked. I brought a camp stove and lanterns, so I wasn't too worried about power. My cell phone was already on airplane mode. I didn't want any distractions. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, drank some tea, and listened to the wind in the trees. It got cold fast, but I had good sleeping gear. I slept like a rock. The second day, I hiked around the area. The lake was maybe a 5-minute walk from the cabin. It was surrounded by thick trees and looked like no one had fished or swum in it for years. There was a small dock that was half-rotted and leaning sideways. I walked deeper into the woods, followed some deer trails, and didn't see another soul. It was perfect. That evening, as I was eating, I thought I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps, slow and crunching over leaves. I stopped chewing and listened. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I went out with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying and the sound of the wind. By the fourth day, I was starting to feel like something was off. It was small things at first. I'd leave something in one place and later it would be in another. My boots were by the door when I went to bed, but in the morning they were on the porch. I thought maybe I was just forgetting. Maybe I'd kicked them out when I opened the door. The can opener was on the counter, and then later it was under the bed. I told myself I must have knocked it off somehow. But that night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder and closer. I sat by the fire, listening. Then I heard something knock against the side of the cabin. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone tapping, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out. The night was cold and silent. I shined the light all around, but saw nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening. The trees creaked, and the wind picked up. I was starting to feel exposed, so I went back inside and locked the door. I slept poorly. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up thinking I heard something. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing outside the window. Slow, deep breathing, like someone was standing there watching me. But when I checked, no one was there. The next day, I decided to walk the perimeter of the cabin and look for tracks. I found some scuff marks near the back, like something had been dragged through the leaves, but no clear footprints. Still, I had this gut feeling someone had been there. I started keeping the hatchet close. On the 5th night, things got worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to a crashing sound outside. It sounded like something had fallen over. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The stack of firewood I'd neatly arranged was knocked over, scattered all over the ground. I looked around, scanning with the light, and saw something move between the trees. It was fast, too fast for me to get a good look. My heart started racing. I stood there for a while, waiting, then backed into the cabin and locked the door. I moved the table in front of it just in case. In the morning, I checked again. The firewood was definitely knocked over deliberately. Some of the logs were thrown far from the stack. I walked into the trees in the direction where I saw the movement, and I found a few broken branches and what looked like a piece of cloth caught on a limb. It was dark and torn, maybe from a jacket. That's when I knew for sure someone was out there. I packed most of my things, thinking I should leave early. But when I tried to start my SUV, it wouldn't turn over. I checked everything I could. The battery was fine. Gas was full. It just wouldn't start. Like something electrical had gone out. I couldn't fix it. I considered hiking out, but the nearest town was over 20 miles away, and I wasn't sure I'd make it before dark. I still had enough food and water, so I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. That night was the worst. I kept the fire going and sat with my back to the wall, hatchet in my lap. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, then the tapping. This time, it was all around the cabin. Tap, 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 moving from one side to the other, then silence, then a loud thud against the back wall, like something heavy had slammed into it. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door. Then I heard the door handle move. Slowly, it jiggled a little, then more. Someone was trying to open it. The table I'd pushed in front held firm. I stayed still, barely breathing. Eventually, the handle stopped moving. I heard footsteps again, slow and steady, walking around the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, I grabbed my backpack, the hatchet, and a few essentials, and I started walking. I didn't care about leaving stuff behind. I just needed to get out. I hiked fast, cutting through the woods instead of following the long winding path I drove in on. It was rough going, and my boots were soaked in mud. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But I didn't. After several hours, I reached a road. It wasn't the same one I came in on, but I flagged down a passing truck. The driver took me into town. I called the sheriff and told him what happened. He sent a deputy to check out the cabin. Later, I got a call. They found the cabin, but there were no signs of anyone else. The firewood was scattered, and the door had scratches around the handle, but nothing else. My SUV was still there, and it started up just fine when the deputy tried it. They told me it was probably a bear, maybe a prankster, but I know what I heard, what I saw. I never went back to get my things. I didn't care. I just wanted to be done with it. That trip was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear my head, but I came back more tense than ever. Even now, I don't like being alone in the woods. Sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I still hear that slow tapping in my mind. And every once in a while, I wake up, heart racing, sure that someone is standing just outside my window. I needed to get away, not in the dramatic kind of way people say when they want to escape city life for a week, but in the kind of way where I felt like my chest was constantly tight, my sleep was broken every night, and even food started to taste like paper. Life had been weighing on me too much. Deadlines, calls, meetings that bled into my weekends. Everything had started to blend together into one long, meaningless loop. I didn't want a vacation. I wanted silence. I wanted to feel far from everything. I booked a cabin online that same night. It was deep in the forest, somewhere in northern Washington. No neighbors, no cell reception, no internet. The listing said it had solar power for lights and a small propane stove. I didn't care much about the details. I just saw the photos of the trees surrounding it and a small dock by a lake, and I hit reserve. 3 days later, I loaded up my old Jeep with supplies. A cooler full of food, extra water, 2 gas cans, my hiking boots, and enough books to fill a shelf. I had a few small tools, a hunting knife I never really used, and a flare gun I kept around from my old backpacking days. I reached the cabin by late afternoon. The gravel road that led there stretched far off the main route, winding deeper into thick woods. I didn't pass a single other car once I turned off the highway. Just the rustling of trees, the sound of gravel under my tires, and the faint humming of the engine. When I pulled up, the place was exactly like the photos. A little wood cabin, nothing fancy. Weathered gray siding, 1 small front window, a slanted tin roof. To the left was a narrow footpath that led to the lake. It wasn't huge, just big enough to disappear into the trees on the far side. I stepped inside and it was even smaller than I expected. 1 room, a cot, a small kitchen counter, a table, a battery-powered radio on a shelf. No TV, no clock, no distractions. Perfect. I unpacked slowly, trying not to think about work or people or emails waiting for me back home. The place smelled like cedar and dust. It was cold, so I lit the propane heater mounted on the wall and changed into warmer clothes. That first night, I sat on the tiny wooden deck out front with a beer in my hand and a blanket around my shoulders. The stars came out one by one, clearer than I'd seen in years. The wind moved through the trees like a slow wave. I didn't hear a single engine, not one plane overhead, no voices. I didn't realize how badly I'd needed that quiet until I was sitting in the middle of it. But it didn't last. It started the second night. I just finished eating. Something simple, beans and toast. I stepped outside to brush my teeth by the railing. The forest was pitch black. The solar light by the door gave off a pale glow, just enough to see the edge of the path. Beyond that, everything looked like a black curtain. I heard something crunch. Not wind, not a branch falling. A single, sharp crunch, like a boot pressing into dead leaves. I stopped brushing. My ears strained. Nothing followed. Just the sound of my own heartbeat suddenly feeling too loud. I waited. Then I spat into the dirt and stepped back inside. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. I even tried to laugh it off. But I made sure to lock the door. And when I crawled into the cot that night, I kept my knife on the small table beside me. Day 3 was quiet. I read most of the day, wandered down to the lake, skipped stones. I didn't hear or see anything strange. I tried to tell myself that whatever I thought I heard the night before was just my nerves catching up to me. But that night, just as I was about to turn off the solar lamp by the door, I noticed something. Footprints. They weren't mine. Mine were obvious, deep, wide-heeled, walking back and forth from the Jeep, around the side of the cabin, and down to the lake. But these prints were lighter, narrower, almost like a running shoe or a trail boot. They led from the tree line straight up to the back of the cabin. I stood there for a long time staring at them, barely blinking. They didn't lead away, just to the back. I walked slowly to the back window and looked out. Just trees. So many trees. Thick trunks packed tightly together, branches tangling overhead. I tried to trace where the prints ended, but the moonlight was too faint to see beyond the few feet illuminated by the solar lamp. I didn't sleep that night. I laid there on the cot, eyes on the ceiling, gripping the knife in one hand under the blanket. Every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked, I jumped. By morning, I had a pounding headache and a dry throat. I walked around the cabin in the daylight. The prints were still there, clear as ever. No others leading away. I circled the entire building 3 times. Nothing else. I tried to convince myself again. Maybe they were mine. Maybe I didn't notice them when I first got there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there at the back wall, watching, listening. I decided to stay inside most of that day. I kept the knife nearby. I double-checked the lock on the door. I didn't even go down to the lake. That night, I pushed the table in front of the door. Day 5 is when things really shifted. I woke up to find the prints were back. But this time, they were on both sides of the cabin. A full circle, like someone had walked the perimeter during the night. Slowly. Worse, I found a small mark scratched into the siding near the front window. 3 straight lines, about 4 inches long, dug deep into the wood like someone had used a knife or maybe even a rock. I froze when I saw it. It wasn't a random accident. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Someone had come to the cabin again. I felt my chest tighten. I packed a bag quickly with food, water, and my flare gun. I hiked to where I'd parked the Jeep. That's when my stomach dropped. All 4 tires were flat, slashed, not slowly leaking, not popped. Clean cuts, deep and straight, like someone used a sharp blade. The Jeep wasn't going anywhere. I just stood there with the wind blowing through the trees, staring at my only way out, feeling something heavy build in my chest. I turned back toward the cabin, but I didn't go inside. I just sat on the porch for hours, watching the tree line. Whoever was out there, they were watching. They had to be. They didn't want me to leave. That night, I barely moved. I turned off the solar lights and sat in complete darkness, back against the wall, knife in my hand, flare gun within reach. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. Just after midnight, I heard movement outside. Not footsteps, something slower, a brushing sound, like fabric or a jacket scraping against tree bark. Then silence, then a soft knock. Not at the door, at the window, just a single knock. Then nothing. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I sat there for hours, my legs cramping, my hand gripping the knife so tightly that my knuckles went numb. I never heard footsteps leave. When morning came, I peeked out the window. No one, nothing, but the window had smudges on it now, like someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. Not fists, not palms, just fingertips. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. I hiked for miles that day, trying to find a signal. I walked with the flare gun in my jacket, eyes darting to every sound, every flicker of movement. But there was no reception, no roads, just endless trees and silence. I went back to the cabin near sunset, exhausted and more afraid than I'd ever been in my life. That night, I didn't sit in the dark. I turned on every light I had, solar lamps, battery-powered lanterns, even a flashlight strapped to the ceiling. I wanted whoever was out there to know that I was awake, that I was alert, and that I was done being afraid. But it didn't matter. Just after 2 a.m., the power went out. All the lights blinked off at once, even the solar ones. I froze. I heard movement again, this time louder, crunching, deliberate, not trying to hide, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. Then I heard the front doorknob rattle, not banging, not forced, just turning slowly, testing the lock. Then silence again. I raised the flare gun and aimed it at the door. I didn't care anymore. If they came through, I was pulling the trigger. But nothing happened. No one came in. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun finally came up, and I was still sitting there, flare gun aimed at the door, heart beating like a war drum. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the tires. I didn't care about food. I was leaving. I filled my pack with water, the flare gun, the knife, and a flashlight. Then I left a note inside the cabin, just in case, saying where I was going and what had happened. I didn't know if anyone would ever find it, but I felt like I had to. I walked for hours, following the gravel road back toward the highway. My legs ached. My back felt like it was splitting, but I kept going. Around noon, I don't know why I agreed to go up there alone. Maybe I needed the break. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. Work had been piling up. My phone never seemed to stop buzzing, and my head felt like it was always full. So when I found the old listing for a cheap, off-grid cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, it seemed like a good idea. Remote, quiet, surrounded by woods. Just me, nature, and some peace. The drive took most of the day. The last few hours were through dirt roads, winding up into the forest. My tires kicked up dust and the GPS stopped working halfway in, but I had printed directions and kept going. The sun was setting when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, made of weathered wood with a metal roof that looked like it had been patched a few times. No one around for miles. It felt like I had driven into another world. The cabin didn't have electricity. There was a wood stove, a couple of oil lamps, a hand pump for water out back, and an outhouse about 50 yards from the back door. I unpacked my stuff, mostly canned food, a few gallons of water, my sleeping bag, a solar-powered lantern, a hunting knife I never really used, and some basic tools. There was a logbook on the little table inside. Other people had stayed there before. Most of the entries were short. Dates, weather, notes about animals seen or repairs needed. The last entry was from 2 years ago. That felt strange, but I told myself it just wasn't a popular place. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. No hum from a fridge or heating unit, no passing cars or distant voices. Just wind through trees and the occasional crack of something moving in the woods. I tried to sleep, but kept waking up. I thought I heard footsteps outside at one point, but when I got up and looked out, there was nothing, just my imagination. The second day, I tried to relax. I went for a short walk in the woods, staying close enough to see the cabin behind the trees. The forest was thick, with tall pines and ferns everywhere. I didn't see any animals, but I heard birds and the sound of squirrels running through the branches. It was peaceful, but I kept checking over my shoulder. Something felt off, though I couldn't say what. Later that afternoon, I was splitting some wood when I heard a soft noise from the trees, like someone whispering. I stopped and listened. It was faint, almost like the sound of fabric rubbing together. I called out, but then remembered not to. There was no one out here. I chalked it up to the wind and went back to work. That night, I lit the oil lamp and read a little from an old paperback I brought. I couldn't focus, though. I kept looking at the window. There were no curtains, just glass panes. It got dark fast in the woods. I felt like I was being watched, but I told myself it was just nerves. I locked the door, even though it was just a basic latch, and set the hatchet near my sleeping bag. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. It was cold, and the sky was full of stars. I started toward the outhouse when I heard a soft crunch in the trees. I stopped and waited. Another crunch. Slow, measured, not like a deer running or a branch falling. It sounded like footsteps. My skin went cold. I slowly backed up and went back into the cabin. I locked the door and sat there, listening. Nothing for a while. Then, just before dawn, I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. Just once. Then silence again. By the third day, I was unsettled. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. Animals. Maybe another hiker out there. But I hadn't seen any signs of people. I hadn't even seen any animals up close. Just bird calls and the sound of squirrels, but no deer or tracks. No sign of larger animals. Felt wrong. I tried hiking a bit farther from the cabin that afternoon. I marked my path carefully with bits of red cloth tied to branches. About 30 minutes in, I found something that made my stomach turn. A campsite, torn apart, a collapsed tent, shredded sleeping bag, and what looked like a pot still hanging over a cold fire pit. But everything was covered in moss and leaves. It had been abandoned a long time. I didn't see any signs of who had been there. No names, no gear, no cooler or bags. I took a few pictures with my phone, but there was no signal. I hurried back to the cabin, following my trail markers. Took longer than it should have. Some of the red cloth pieces were missing. A few had been tied to different branches. I know how I left them. Something had moved them. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of tapping. Very light, right on the window. I sat up and stared at it, heart racing. There was no shape outside, no movement, just the tapping. Then it stopped. I got up and went to the window, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. But when I looked down, there were faint smudges on the glass, as if fingers had pressed against it. I didn't go outside again until the sun came up. I searched the ground near the window. No tracks. The ground was soft from rain the day before, but it was like nothing had been there. I checked the whole cabin perimeter. No signs of animals or people, just that feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided I was done. I started packing up. My plan was to leave before noon, drive out while it was still light. I loaded the car, locked up the cabin out of habit, and started down the dirt road. I didn't get far. Maybe 10 minutes in, I came around a bend and saw something in the road. A tree. Not a big one, but enough to block my car. It hadn't been there before. It looked fresh, green leaves, damp bark, like it had been cut down recently. There were no storm signs, no wind damage. I got out to move it, but it was too heavy to drag on my own. That's when I noticed something worse. The road behind me was different. I turned around to go back, maybe try the other direction, but I couldn't find the turn I came from. It was all trees, no tire tracks, no sign I had just come that way. I drove forward again, found the same fallen tree, same spot, like I was stuck in a loop. I backed up, heart pounding, and drove in the other direction. Felt wrong, like I wasn't moving away from the cabin, but circling it. I drove for maybe 20 minutes before the road just ended. Not a dead end, just ended. Like the path was swallowed up by forest. No trail, no signs. I stopped the car and got out. I checked the GPS again. Nothing, just a blank screen. I tried to use the compass I brought. Spun slowly, then stopped pointing north. Then started spinning again. I stood there, trying to breathe, trying to figure out what was going on. I wasn't far from the cabin, less than 2 miles if I guessed right, but I felt like I was deeper in than ever. I drove back. This time I found the cabin again, like it had been waiting for me. I sat in the car for a long time. Then I went back inside. I didn't know what else to do. The next few days were a blur. I stayed inside mostly. I rationed my food. I tried the road a couple more times, but it always twisted back. I even tried hiking out with a full pack. But no matter what direction I went, I'd find myself near the same place. A clearing with a broken fence. A dry creek bed. The cabin never far behind. At night, the tapping came back. Sometimes footsteps. Once, I heard breathing just outside the door. Not heavy, just soft, steady, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't sleep. I kept the knife in my hand, the lantern on low. I stopped keeping track of days. My phone battery died. I started marking the inside wall to count time. I was down to my last few cans of food. The water pump still worked, but I boiled everything just to be sure. I couldn't remember the last time I had heard birds. Even the squirrels were gone. Then, one morning, I woke up and it was just different. The air smelled clean, lighter. I went outside and the woods looked less dense, like something had pulled back. I got in the car again. The road was there. The fallen tree was gone. I drove fast, not stopping, not looking back. It took an hour to hit pavement again. Then another 2 before I found a town. I didn't talk to anyone. I just kept driving. I still don't know what happened up there. I didn't tell anyone. Not at work, not even my brother. I threw away the knife. I deleted the photos from my phone. I tried to go back to normal, but sometimes I dream about the tapping, about the trees moving when there's no wind. I still check my windows at night, just in case something followed me back.